The idea was that a lot of the linguistic understanding benchmarks were not being sufficiently difficult. Elon's description of it is it's basically like an undergraduate level knowledge and skill test. There's a benchmark we call Machiavelli, which is largely assessing the propensities of LLM agents. See what sort of decisions do they make along the way? Do they screw people over, or are they generally nice? Do they lie a lot? There is something going on in making AI systems a lot more reliable to jailbreaking due to specific algorithmic advances that do not necessarily follow from just scaling the model. If they get expert level virologists, I don't know if I want that being released. Sorry to say, because you'll run some substantial risks of bioweapons.
Hello, and welcome to The Cognitive Revolution, where we interview visionary researchers, entrepreneurs, and builders working on the frontier of artificial intelligence. Each week, we'll explore their revolutionary ideas, and together we'll build a picture of how AI technology will transform work, life, and society in the coming years. I'm Nathan Lebenz, joined by my co-host, Eric Tornberg. As a developer, the journey from concept to production-ready large language model apps is fraught with challenges. Dealing with unpredictable language model outputs, hallucinations, and ballooning API costs can all be blockers to shipping your next AI-powered feature. That's where advanced RAG comes in. With the new RAG++ course from Weights and Biases, you can overcome these hurdles and build reliable, production-ready RAG applications. Go beyond proof of concept and learn how to evaluate systematically. Use hybrid search correctly, and give your RAG system access to tool calling. Based on 21 months of running a customer support bot in production, industry experts at Weights and Biases, Cohere, and Weaviate show you how to get to a deployment-grade RAG application. This offer includes free credits from Cohere to get you started. Make real progress on your large language model development and visit wndb.me/cr to get started with their RAG++ course today. That's wnb.me/cr to get started with their RAG++ course today. Hello, and welcome back to The Cognitive Revolution. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dan Hendrycks, Executive Director of the Center for AI Safety, advisor to Elon Musk's XAI, and one of the most prolific and influential researchers in AI safety and alignment, full stop. While Dan has recently become famous in AI circles for his work developing and advocating for SB 1047, I wanted to use this conversation to highlight what an all-purpose AI powerhouse Dan truly is, and to get his perspective on a number of questions that I've personally been thinking a lot about. And so, this is a long episode in which we cover a tremendous amount of ground, including his early work on activation functions, such as the widely used GELU function, which he developed as an undergrad, and his work on benchmarks, including the insights that allowed him to create, in MMLU and math, some of the longest-lived and most often cited benchmarks in existence today, as well as what he's up to next with a project called Humanity's Last Exam. We also cover his work on AI robustness and alignment, including early work on robustness in image classifiers, which showed how difficult robustness can be to achieve, his 2023 paper introducing representation engineering, a top-down alternative to mechanistic interpretability, which can be used to identify directions in latent space for both monitoring and steering purposes. His 2024 paper with past guests Andy Zhao and Zico Coulter on circuit breakers, which build refusal behaviors more deeply into LLM weights through a specialized fine-tuning process. And most recently, his work on tamper-resistant training, which aims to make it difficult for users of open-source models to remove refusal behaviors via fine-tuning, and which suggests that it might become possible for companies like Meta to open source models with durable guardrails built in. We also touch on a number of big picture issues around AI governance and the geopolitics of AI development, philosophical questions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness, and sociological questions about how AI might help us better forecast future events and generally improve our collective epistemics. We even get a fascinating behind-the-scenes look at how he orchestrated the 2023 AI X-Risk Statement, which was signed by a remarkable set of industry leaders, including the CEOs of DeepMind, Anthropic, and yes, Sam Altman of OpenAI, and which said in full that, quote, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. I think what struck me most about this conversation was that, despite all his experience and success, Dan's approach remains fundamentally experimental and his outlook very empirical. He places far more weight on data and compute than on algorithmic insights as drivers of capabilities advances, and he remains very open-minded, both about how far the current AI paradigm will go and about whether any of the safety approaches we're developing will really work when the chips are down. Ultimately, as you'll hear, that leads him to believe that we would be well served to adopt a defense-in-depth strategy. As always, if you're finding value in the show, we appreciate it when folks take a moment to share it with friends or write an online review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And we welcome your feedback via our website, cognitiverevolution.ai, or by DMing me on your favorite social network. Now, I hope you enjoyed this expansive discussion with one of the most impactful figures in AI safety and alignment. This is the great Dan Hendrycks. Dan Hendrycks, Executive Director of the Center for AI Safety. Welcome to the Cognitive Revolution.
Glad to be here.
I'm super excited to have you. You've been on my bucket list of top target guests for a long time, and I'm glad we're finally making this happen. What I thought we would do today is ask all the questions that I really want to ask of you and just get your take on a ton of different issues and just get your sort of outlook on all these different issues, basically get the Dan Hendrycks AI worldview from a lot of different perspectives. I think it'll be quite informative for everyone, but starting with me. For starters, I looked you up on Google Scholar, found your number one cited paper still to this day is, maybe you can pronounce it for me, 2016, it's like a GIF or GIF thing. Is it
Yes,
GELU
it's exactly
or GELU?
that. I haven't decided. I'd say GELU more frequently, but people can make up their minds, yeah.
All right, I think the creator gets to decide. So 2016 GELU.
Sure.
So this was a new activation function, which basically was better than old activation functions and has been used in a ton of neural networks that people have trained since. I think it's also been maybe somewhat superseded. You can comment on, is it still the state of the art or have new, even more elaborate tweaks improved on it? But I'd love to get your kind of zoomed out sense of what are these activation functions doing in the first place? How should we understand them? I think people have studied a lot, like the attention mechanism, and many people have a sense for sort of the residual stream as the core object and the sort of reads from the other parts back to it and all that sort of stuff. But what are these activation functions doing? I think they're underappreciated. What should our mental model of that be?
Yeah, so to back up a bit, the GELU is a function that's like X times the cumulative distribution function of the normal distribution of X. So it's something complicated like that. In that line of research, we also made mention of other variants on it, like X times the sigmoid of X, called the CELU, which we coined in that paper as well. This was largely presented as an alternative to the ReLU, which is X times the indicator of whether X is positive. So the ReLU is like that in its shape. The GELU and CELU are more like these. They like curve down and then go up. But anyway, this was my first paper and my first internship. I was like, I got to work on a paper before I get into the safety stuff, just so I can learn the ropes. And then in the first week of that internship, I stumbled across that and then wrote it up and put it on archive. Since then, it's been in the CELU are, I think, pretty much the main activation in every cutting edge transformer model, GPT and Grok and Llama, et cetera. As far as an intuition, I mean, I don't know. I think it's not really in deep learning about understanding. It's largely performance driven. And so that's why I think it's propagated, not because it is better theory or because it's more principled. It just tends to work better. When intuition that led me to think of it is that the ReLU is like a flat line and then it's a straight linear line. And so it's those two lines next to each other. And that seemed like a sharp transition. And I was thinking the general lesson in looking at machine learning and over the past decades is you don't want sharp things. You want things being smooth, more probabilistic. And so I was trying to think of what's a natural way of smoothing that sharp kink in the ReLU. And since the ReLU is X times an indicator function, which is a step function, X times a step function, I just think smooth the step function. And then what's a natural way of smoothing a step function? Something like a cumulative distribution function or a sigmoid type of shape feels like a natural way of going about that. So that's what gave rise to it. And then after that first week in research and doing capabilities, I thought, okay, I could do capabilities now. So then ever since that, I've been focusing on safety research.
Do you have an intuition? You said, why is it better? We don't know. You had your intuition for why it was something to be worth trying.
I mean, there's complicated ones one can give, like when doing filtering of signals, there are kind of sharp filters. And then there are some of these smoother filters, audio processing, and the smooth ones tend to be better. They're a bit more computationally expensive. So I think just in other domains, sharp filters are generally not what you want to do. But I don't know. My sort of philosophy is you, in deep learning and in other things, just try and find things that work and are impactful and not really care too much about the deep underlying reasons because they're largely inaccessible. A lot of things are not obvious even in hindsight what they're doing. For a lot of my papers, a lot of the methods for them, it's not clear what they're actually doing, even in hindsight. And that's just a sort of fact of dealing with complex systems. There are limits to what inspection can unearth. And that's just the world we live in.
So could you give us just a little bit more on the understanding of activation functions as signal filtering?
Yeah, I think they're like detectors or something like that. So interpretation of activation functions could be, let's say you've got something that scores whether there's a whisker in an image. All right. And then if the neuron has a negative correlation with the whisker, that could be almost anything. That could be a plane. That could be a chair. There are lots of things that are in the opposite or in a different direction from a whisker. But meanwhile, if something is very positively related, that is an indication that you actually have found something like a whisker. So throw out the sort of negative signal or the zero signal, because that doesn't really help you, and preserve the sort of positive signal. So that's why one might want to filter, but one might not want to do just a. So the ReLU is saying throw out all negative signal, keep all positive signal, but it does so in a very sharp way. And then this just does it in a smoother way.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of Eliezer's, the opposite of stupidity is not intelligence. Infinite ways to be wrong. So if all we're signaling is that there's not something here, we'll just filter that.
So suppress those signals. That's right.
So one thing I've been really interested in recently is the series of papers called Kolmogorov-Arnold networks. Seeming Liu is the lead author, and it's out of Max Tegmark's group. I guess they're doing some specific things. I think learnable activation functions feel like maybe the next big thing. Like everything is learnable except for the activation functions in many networks today, and they've figured out a way to make them learnable. And they've also got some interesting stuff around how to initialize them intentionally to enable different capabilities. Feels a little bit more neurosymbolic in its, kind of form. And I can imagine it, going even further in that direction. But what's your sort of expectation for that sort of work?
My higher level view of research on architectural changes in deep learning is that it's probably not an area to investigate that much, largely because there's a sort of silent graveyard of attempts over the past 7 years since the transformer to try and improve on the architectural components. So back in the day, when I started in research in 2016, there were a lot of basic building blocks that were still changing. There was layer norm was introduced the year I started research. The transformer was introduced sometime later. There's still lots of different activation functions. And I think basically the GELU and CELU was the end of that. Transformers looked almost like the end of architectures. There's still some changes, maybe with some state space ones, but those still aren't very used in industry. So I think that as far as architectural research, I would generally bet against it just because so much time has happened since those advancements. It suggests that if there are advancements, it's going to be very high-hanging fruit, and that the low-hanging fruit has been plucked. I think maybe changes in loss functions are a good idea. Changes in the types of data that things train on, I think there's more that one can do there. But on the architectural level, I'm generally suspicious of any major advancements. And this isn't to say that it won't happen, but by default, for any sort of interesting or tantalizing line of research, I'm largely just going to assume that there won't be anything to it, just because it's been so many years since a solid advancement in the architecture of deep learning models.
So does that make you sort of a scaling maximalist? The idea is basically just that sort of any architecture will do, and you can maybe get a little more efficiency here or there, but ultimately the same kind of base infrastructure trends are what you expect to drive the future.
So in deep learning, there's algorithms, data, and compute. And then algorithms, there's the architecture, and there's the loss function, and how those are, and how it processes the data. I think on the architectural front, there's probably not as much. And I think that if we just keep scaling up the models and keep giving them more data, then I'd expect that they'll get substantially smarter. As far as roadblocks to getting a much more capable AI systems, I'd be most worried about data and trying to improve synthetic data, try and get one's hands on more data, rather than trying to find some architectural improvements, which maybe will help only marginally. I think the main change in the past 7 years has been using a mixture of experts model and mixture of experts transformer model. And I don't know exactly its efficiency improvement. Maybe it's something like 30%. That isn't as substantial as scaling up compute 10x more or getting 10x more data. I think the other axes are the raw resources axes compared to the research insight axis is a bit more of the bottleneck for more performance systems. Research will help, but I think it'll be a lot harder to get those sorts of advancements. And I expect far fewer of them, and the ones that we do get not to help as much as 10x more compute or 10x more tokens.
So your expectation is basically scale inputs and a 2022 era transformer big enough can get you to AGI and beyond.
I think that in practice, it won't actually turn out that way. I think that there will be continued changes and people will make things more efficient. I would guess that after one would get a very strong system, maybe you could actually train it in this less efficient way. But I think that there'll be changes in the data. Maybe they'll be given different objectives compared to just the next token prediction objective. Maybe they'll have next day prediction or something like that instead of next token prediction. So I certainly expect some changes though, but by default, I don't expect many of them. I think that people do play up the extent to which algorithmic progress is necessary for getting good results, and the amount of secret sauce inside of labs, I think, is actually fairly minimal. And I think the thing doing most of the heavy lifting, compute and data. We recently looked at various open weight models, and assuming that they've trained on a lot of tokens, we sort of plotted their capabilities, their performance on various benchmarks against compute, and found roughly a 95% correlation. So although there are different training recipes and they're doing supervised fine tuning in different ways, it doesn't seem to make that much of a difference overall. Compute seems to be, to a first order approximation, the main factor driving these advancements. There will be some algorithmic improvements along the way, and they may help to some extent. But I think primarily, at least if we zoom out, in the past 7 years, where have the primary changes come from? It's been from utilizing data more effectively and using more of it. So basically, around the time of BERT, which I don't know, was maybe 2018, they're training on a few gigabytes of text. And then Roberta came after BERT, which trained on about 10x more text. And we've just been 10xing since then. And that's been the main driver of a lot of these improvements, where the architecture has been fairly similar. So I think the main algorithmic advances in the past 7 or so years have primarily been humanity recognizing that maybe we should just train on more data. We kept learning that lesson with the chinchilla scaling laws and so on. And we are now getting to the point where we're training on most of the publicly available data, publicly available text, I should say. There's still YouTube. And that could present a sort of wall to algorithmic advances. So maybe the scaling will stop sometime soon. It's totally in the realm of possibilities. We'll basically just have to see what happens and whether synthetic data can continue the trend. Most of the trend has been very confounded by the fact that we just train on more tokens per parameter, and we just keep increasing that ratio across time.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
The Cognitive Revolution is brought to you by Shopify. I've known Shopify as the world's leading e-commerce platform for years. But it was only recently, when I started a project with my friends at Quickly, that I realized just how dominant Shopify really is. Quickly is an urgency marketing platform that's been running innovative, time-limited marketing activations for major brands for years. Now, we're working together to build an AI layer, which will use generative AI to scale their service to long-tail e-commerce businesses. And since Shopify has the largest market share, the most robust APIs, and the most thriving application ecosystem, we are building exclusively for the Shopify platform. So, if you're building an e-commerce business, upgrade to Shopify and you'll enjoy not only their market-leading checkout system, but also an increasingly robust library of cutting-edge AI apps like Quickly, many of which will be exclusive to Shopify on launch. Cognitive Revolution listeners can sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/cognitive, where cognitive is all lowercase. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, so visit shopify.com/cognitive to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/cognitive. The Cognitive Revolution is brought to you by LMNT, a zero-sugar electrolyte drink mix that's working to change how we think about the role of salt in hydration and performance. I have to say, when I started an AI podcast, I never thought we'd be sponsored by a drink company. But when LMNT inquired about a possible sponsorship, they also offered to send me a sample pack, and so I figured, might as well try it out. When the sample arrived, my wife Amy could not believe what a perfect fit it was for me specifically. For years, I have felt that my body needs more salt than nutrition labels indicate, and so I was interested to learn that the LMNT formula is based on a growing body of research suggesting that most people perform best with 2 to 3 times more sodium than official guidelines recommend. I was also fascinated to see that they specifically recommend it for people who fast regularly, since I personally don't eat until dinner time most days. Obviously, I'm not a doctor, and what my body responds well to may or may not work well for you. But after drinking LMNT for a couple of weeks, I can sincerely say that I really do enjoy the product. My favorite flavors so far are the mango chili and grapefruit, and I for one also enjoy the raw, unflavored version, which reminds me of the taste of the ocean. If you're curious about optimizing your electrolyte intake, you can support the show and get a free sample pack with any purchase by visiting drinklmnt.com/TCR. That's drinklmnt.com/TCR. When I look at new architectures, certainly recognizing that what you're saying is true, that like most of the things that appear to be an improvement end up not panning out, or at scale they sort of converge or whatever, I have found it somewhat helpful to look for new, what I call micro skills, which is there something structurally enabled by this new architecture that alternative architectures couldn't do? And then what seems to be happening, at least right now with the state-space models, is like the hybrid form tends to be the best. You seem to get the best of both sets of micro skills. In the case of the state-space models, they can't recall all prior tokens in the same way that a attention-based mechanism can, but they do seem to be better at learning from a really sparse signal. And in the case of the cans, it's like they have maybe a lot of weaknesses, but they do have some strengths in terms of being like composable. You can write down a function and you can represent that in a can in a way that is like literally representing the equation. Whereas with a transformer, you can converge on it, but it's like a weird sort of thing. Do you find that compelling, or how would you tell me to update my thinking?
I think there are a lot of ways to build systems with attractive properties, but the main thing is overall, what's its performance? So I was trained mostly doing computer vision type of papers because that was the main way of assessing deep learning progress was on image tasks in the past. And culturally, they just be, what's the performance? Because you could, for instance, construct convnets that would have lots of nice properties, like some equivariance to some specific transformations. And you could do some top-down imposition of those properties, but overall, they weren't beneficial or necessary. It's also the case that with scaling, there's a rising tide lifts all boats phenomenon, such that some of the specific engineering that happens with current models just gets taken care of when you have a more generally capable model in the future. It has a wide set of different capabilities, and some of its gaps it can end up filling in with some of its other capabilities. I think trying to go for an aesthetic, it can solve some of these specific toy tasks, or it has nice mathematical properties. As a researcher, I kind of just embody the deep learning philosophy. You look at the number, you throw the stuff at the wall, you see what sticks. You have some vague intuitions, like wild sounding, maybe they're even neurosymbolically inspired. You ultimately just select what's most effective. and not really think too much about the details or other sorts of properties. That I think is quite intellectually offensive to a lot of other traditional machine learning researchers, or you're wanting some proof, some justification for things. I think they're nice to have properties, but for all that, I don't know if it's going to overall improve the performance or be necessary at a higher level of scale. So we'll just see. By default, looks like there's a very low rate and looks like we're getting a lot of progress from other things. So I'm just going to mainly expect most of the progress to come from other things and less to come from that.
Gotcha. This is kind of a far out question, but I do have one visualization that I keep coming back to, which I don't think has steered me too far wrong yet. And that is of some like abstract shape that is reality, and the model being basically a vacuum pull that is like shrink wrapping around this reality. And just the tighter you pull, like the closer the shrink wrap gets to this weird shape. How do you react to that? Do you have any of your own
I
that
like
you'd like
that.
to share?
I like that because it has the multidimensionality. So I think as far as analogies or intuition pumps to think about these systems, I think they're so confusing because we don't understand intelligence. And since we don't understand intelligence, we don't understand these AI systems. One observation about intelligence is that human capabilities are quite lopsided and strange. So for instance, we speak all the time, and yet we constantly pause and say, and if you actually transcribe our sentences, maybe half of them are fully grammatical. Even so, we think of ourselves as very smart. We're better at doing a lot of social modeling relatively, like we're okay at that. We are pretty bad at arithmetic though, which you'd think should be a lot easier than doing theory of mind and social modeling and picking up on subtle cues. Our vision system is really fantastic. Even humans have a very not necessarily simple capabilities profile. And so likewise, we should expect a somewhat strange capabilities profile of AI systems as well, where they're able to get a silver at the IMO, but at the same time, they can't count the number of R's in Raspberry reliably. Another intuition that I think gives the most mileage for deep learning systems is thinking of them just as complex systems. So cats are complex systems, human brains are complex systems, the economy is a complex system, ecosystems are complex systems. And those have a lot of unexpected properties. You can't reason your way through them or even mechanistically predict exactly what's going to happen because there's so many parts, so many loose connections, so many feedback loops, which give rise to new emergent phenomena and qualitatively distinct properties. I think if people are trying to wrap their head around it to some extent, they could try and learn some more about complex systems to get intuitions for those. We have a lecture on complex systems in AISafetyBook.com where we discuss the complex systems and its analogies to AI and its implications for AI safety. But that's basically been the only analogy that hasn't led me astray and has provided many predictions.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Let's change gears and talk about benchmarks. You have done some important work in benchmarking, most famously with MMLU, which certainly everybody will be familiar with, seeing that the frontier models compare themselves on MMLU. I don't know necessarily how much intuition people have for what the questions actually consist of. Back when I was doing the GPT-4 Red Team project, I found that basically it was blowing all the other benchmarks away. And MMLU was the one where it was still like not getting all the questions right. So interested in a little bit of the story, a little bit of like how that was put together, what the questions are, how you were able to create a benchmark that endured for 5 years when almost every other one was like quickly rendered obsolete. But then also we seem to be maybe getting there with MMLU too. So we have to kind of look also to what's next.
Yeah, that's right. So MMLU has 57 different subjects like history, calculus, professional law, you name it, it's probably in there, and it's probably at some different levels of difficulty. Like there's graduate physics exam questions, there's arithmetic questions, there's a span of difficulty and a lot of breadth and depth. The idea was that a lot of the linguistic understanding benchmarks were not being sufficiently difficult. I was seeing basically on every few months newly proposed benchmarks dying because they kept really searching for places where the model wouldn't linguistically understand something, but their capabilities just kept improving. So it seemed to me that these weren't really doing computational or linguistics or natural language processing as much as text processing, and that we shouldn't be trying to understand their linguistic strengths, because it seemed that they understood syntax and grammar and basics of English pretty well. Then I was thinking the benchmarks weren't doing a good enough job at capturing their capabilities. People had tried doing common sense as a sort of set of benchmarks, but they kept getting common sense as well. This used to be an extremely contentious thing to say, that they could predict that, like, if you light a match and put it on a pile of leaves, maybe that will cause a fire. LLMs can say that, and that's considered some common sense knowledge. Where people would say, no, they don't have common sense. There is sort of a collective lie. I think that generally in the academic community, they have a very strong preference for underclaiming and try and severely penalize things that are deemed overclaiming, such as saying they have common sense, which was true before, maybe a year and a half before, like, people were not going to get hit over the head saying that type of thing. And that is for historical reasons. It's because there's an AI winter. So there's generally extreme hesitation toward saying surprising sounding things, and generally a strong incentive for underclaiming. That's, I think, one reason why the world was so caught by surprise by ChatGPT as well. Before that, I was making a benchmark for measuring ethical understanding, but then the AI systems got common sense. And so it was looking like they were starting to do okay at it. So then, I need something harder. What's the sort of next stage in ethics, or what are trickier ethical scenarios I can give them? And then I thought, I know, tort law and criminal law seem like a fantastic set of questions. So I collected lots of legal questions, and then that seemed pretty tough for them. And so there are like, I don't know, maybe like 2,000 legal questions in MMLU or something. So a big chunk of the data set. And I thought, I know, why don't we just do some other types of exams? Like basically pretty much any exam that people give humans, let's just throw that in there. Basically, we copy and pasted lots of data for a month, and then out came the data set. And I think initially NLP researchers were, oh, this is bad. This is going to incentivize models to not learn linguistics and the English language better. It's going to incentivize them to just learn everything online or memorize everything. So it was not well received initially, I think, partly because it was saying we're focusing on linguistic understanding. We're in a different sort of paradigm now. But eventually things sort of shone through. So we just copy paste the data set, and then we released that collection, and it looked like models started doing pretty well. I think that knowledge understanding was the correct next thing to look at. After we published the paper, or when we were publishing the paper, we noticed that they did a lot worse on STEM subjects. So that incentivized us to look more specifically at the STEM topics, and then collected the MATH or math data set, which is a collection of, I think, 12,500 competitive math questions. That seems to be maybe like the number 3 benchmark used, and MMLU is like the number 1, and maybe like LMSys is like number 2. These all will be beaten by the LLMs maybe in the next year or two. There will need to be some things to replace them.
Before we go on to what's next, you've done a bunch of different benchmarks, including some regarding issues like deception, and there's one that's like the Machiavellian benchmark. Do you want to just highlight any other benchmarks that you think are as yet still underappreciated?
I think that the Machiavelli one, I'll just speak about that one. So there's a benchmark we call Machiavelli, which is largely assessing the propensities of LLM agents. So you plot them in various different text adventure games where these are choose your own adventures, and you just have them play through that and see where they wind up. What sort of decisions do they make along the way? Do they screw people over, or are they generally nice? Are they really competitive if you're incentivizing them to get reward? Do they treat other players as more of means to an end? Do they lie a lot? So this, I think, was a benchmark that we just designed for when LLMs would be more like AI agents. And I think that basically the capabilities aren't there yet. Some of these benchmarks we basically just put into place as something that would become relevant later. I tend not to do that type of research as much now, where I anticipate the paper will only become relevant 2 years in the future. That's a little riskier, but I think that paper may end up just being used when they get more agent-like capabilities. And then we want to estimate their propensities and try and control them to behave in a more pro-social way and less deceptively, less in a Machiavellian way. I think that's probably one of the main benchmarks that I expect to kick in later. The sort of design philosophy of it is, if you're wanting to measure AI's game playing abilities and keep track of their morally salient properties, you could run them on games like Grand Theft Auto or something, but this is just harder to set up and requires a lot more compute. if you're just wanting to see what types of decisions it makes, I think text adventure games get you a lot of the way there. You don't need to spend as much compute rendering graphics or getting the right drivers. That's what that benchmark is. But yeah, it's currently not particularly used, I think, because the AIs are not very good at being agential yet.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
As a Cognitive Revolution listener, you're obviously interested in cutting-edge AI technology. And with that in mind, I'm proud to say that this episode is brought to you in part by Notion. Notion has been a clear leader in high-value applications of generative AI since the wave began. Earlier this year, we had Notion AI engineer Linus Lee on the podcast. The quality of his insights showcased the caliber of talent that Notion employs. And that inside look at how Notion builds with AI is still extremely valuable. Given my personal focus on AI automation recently, I specifically wanted to highlight Notion's library of workflow and automation templates. If you're looking to streamline your processes and lay the foundation for future AI-driven automation, these templates are an excellent starting point. And even if you're not ready for full automation, you'll benefit immediately from Notion AI, Notion's latest all-in-one AI implementation that searches through thousands of documents, regardless of whether they live in Notion or on some other platform like Slack or Google Docs, to deeply understand the context of your work and generate highly relevant analysis and content just for you. Notion is used by more than half of Fortune 500 companies, helping teams reduce emails, meetings, and time spent searching for information. Want to try it? Head to notion.com/cognitive revolution. You can start for free, and using our link supports the show. So join me in giving Notion AI a shot today at notion.com/cognitive revolution.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry, and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power. So how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/cognitive. That's oracle.com/cognitive. Oracle.com/cognitive.
Just going back to MMLU for 1 second, how do you understand the scores that we're seeing today? There's obviously a lot of debate around, like, for one thing, people may have trained on the data set at this point. You've got the sort of argument from the Francois Chalets of the world that is they have memorized a bunch of ways to solve particular problems. So they're like pattern matching on that and then implementing a certain algorithm, but in some way that's like not general. And then obviously with data sets like these, there's also just issues in the data sets where there's like some questions in the answer key are wrong. So where do you think we are? Like, if I see a 90% on that, what does that mean in practical terms to September 2024?
Yeah, I think that we are now at the high 80% region for MMLU, and we've been stuck there ever since GPT-4. And I think that's because the AI models haven't substantially improved in a general way since GPT-4. They've improved in their formatting of answers and performing some specific tasks, but I don't think in a general way, which is, I think, LMSys is largely reflecting on some summarize this type of tasks or in formatting answers. I think it's measuring that quite well. I think the MATH benchmark is measuring their mathematical problem solving ability, which has improved over the past year through targeted synthetic data creation. But in a general sense, we haven't really trained models that are substantially larger than GPT-4 yet. To my understanding, there are no models that have been trained with more than 10 to the 26 flop. Meanwhile, GPT-3 or GPT-4 was trained around using 10 to the 25 flop. I think the MMLUs are somewhat stagnant in part because the models aren't generally better. They're better in some senses, but not in a very broad raw intelligence type of sense. But that will change as we scale the models. And then I think maybe with a 10x larger model, maybe that'll get in the 90% region. And then I think that will be around the point of saturation for MMLU. People can still use it to try and train their models to get a higher score using less compute, things like that for efficiency research. But it will cease to be a guide for frontier development later on.
Just calibrate against a human for a second. If we take a, let's say, PhD in any one of the subjects that is covered with MMLU, we would expect them to get, what, 90, 95?
Yeah, so we looked at each of the subjects in MMLU and tried estimating what's a 95th percentile test taker likely to get, and then aggregate those scores. And that gives an overall accuracy on MMLU of about 90%. So I think 90% is for each subject, 95th percentile test taker would end up getting. And I think that's
And that's like the 95th percentile of graduate students?
It depends of the test takers. So for instance, for the bar exam, that'd be what's the 95th percentile score on the bar exam. For AP Calculus, it's what's the 95th percentile on AP Calculus. So not necessarily just always adults, but just people who generally do very well at the exam. And when you aggregate all those together, that's around 90% or so. But if you asked an individual human, I think individual humans maybe get, I think we had some MTurk thing and they were getting like around 30 to 40% on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth taking a minute to go just peruse the database of questions, because there's plenty of things you just will have no idea what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, there's a site called Are You Smarter Than an LLM, I think, which just shows you questions from MMLU, and then you start going, oh, I don't remember that bit of economics. Oh, I don't remember that bit of history. Oh, I don't. Yeah. So I think one shorthand for it, or Elon's description of it, is it's basically like an undergraduate level knowledge and skill test. And I think that seems like roughly appropriate. Some of the questions are quite a bit harder. There are graduate school questions in there. But I think that gives the gist of it fairly accurately.
Gotcha. So to bottom line that, it is basically the 95th percentile of test takers gets about 90% in whatever subsection of the MMLU suite of tests. And
but I would guess the models are better than any individual human test taker on it. I think as far as the integrity of it, the sort of claim that there's a lot of contamination, or that people have trained on it or memorized all the answers. Like if they memorized the answers, I would expect a higher score. I'd also expect things not to track difficulty. Like the subjects that were difficult for models 2 years ago are still the subjects that are difficult for models on MMLU this year. So for instance, they still get lower professional law type of questions. If they're just memorizing them, then it should be not track difficulty really at all. It should be more uniform across the board. So I think that sort of undermines that hypothesis. There certainly are some labs that really try and optimize these numbers and maybe try and train on similar types of questions, but they tend to get caught. Scale AI, for instance, for some arithmetic benchmark, created their own variant of it. And then they saw when we test people on our own variant of these questions, what happens to the performance, and then they can catch a few of the models, but most of the models were actually just fine and not training too heavily on those. I think there are maybe a few bad apples, but the leading labs don't seem to really have this sort of issue.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know, my memory of this is not super crisp at this point, but I feel like when I was doing this spot checking in the GPT-4 Red Team era, I think it's the math one where you're supposed to like do all the reasoning and put like a box around the final answer, right?
Yep, that's the math data set.
Maybe I was given the instructions to do that, but it seemed like it had internalized the form of the test in a meaningful way. I remember being like, oh, it's like giving me exactly the sort of box notation. It's doing
Yeah, Llama does that. I think it's because there is a training set of 7,500 examples. And if they were to collect their own data set like that, I think it would cost like several $1 million. So I think that they are just training on the training set, and it teaches the model, the format of the math data set. Yeah.
Gotcha. So training on the, in your view, I guess, or to generalize,
training on the training set is fine.
That's okay. Cool. Well, that does sort of feed into the Francois Chalet critique also, that there's a catalog of well-represented problems that they've had like a chance to go deep on as part of their training. And it at least leaves the door open to sort of an argument that they're running some sort of stored procedure that they've learned as opposed to having a more flexible intelligence.
I mean, it undermines the flexibility of it. There's just a question of, in practice, is it going to be useful? if you have a large enough collection of skills, then maybe that's fine. Michael Jordan, when he'd play basketball, he was saying like every game is like practice because I've already done that exact maneuver before. And I just remember how I went about it then, and I'm just going to do that now. I think an aspersion on deep learning models is a little underspecified if it's to be like a successful critique, because maybe a catalog of a lot of skills is just what a multi-purpose AI system is. But maybe right now the models are having their catalog a little fragile, and it can lead to some incorrect estimates of their abilities. But I think by and large, it's roughly right. If you give AI systems high school level or undergrad type of problems, they're basically going to do a good job most of the time. I think they're a good solution for that. People come with new exams, and they're probably going to generalize to those. So I think it reasonably reflects the actual performance of these. Otherwise, I don't know why students would be paying $20 a month to be using ChatGPT to cheat if it wasn't any good.
How would you describe this? I find myself confused by this broadly. And this is one of those debates where anytime I spend a significant amount of time immersed in one worldview, it starts to feel pretty plausible to me. And so I've felt this sort of like, it seems undeniable that when the ARC AGI folks, and I've had Mike Knoop on the podcast to discuss this, when they say that progress toward AGI has stalled, I cannot empathize with that. It feels to me like, okay, maybe
there hasn't been a scale up
a little bit, but
there hasn't been a scale up. Like that's the confounding one. When people are thinking about progress in it, the same thing happened after GPT-3. I was like, boy, these models are getting really good. And then people are like, oh, you're overreacting. And then a year passed and there wasn't like a substantial advance. So, where's your rapid progress now? But it was just a function of how long does it take them to get the GPUs from NVIDIA? Will NVIDIA give them the GPUs? And then when they get the GPUs, there's creating the new 10x larger supercomputer. And that's just taken people a while. Now I think they're built, and then now they're going to scale them. And so I'd expect we'll see the next generation of AI models in the next 6 months. It's not clear how capable they'll be. Maybe they've hit a data wall. Maybe GPT-4 has trained on all the publicly available tokens, and so the scaling laws really slow down. That's totally a possibility. But in the absence of seeing a model trained on 10x more compute, it seems very difficult to claim that the AI is hitting a wall. We'll have to see if it actually does. So yeah, that's a confounding factor. Have they tried training the 10x larger model, and how did that go? If that went poorly, then that's actually some evidence. But in the absence of people even trying that, then I think it's much too early to weigh in.
How would you describe large language model reasoning today? You mentioned earlier that at one point it was crazy to say, or it was contentious at least to say, that they had common sense. Now we could say, yeah, they generally have common sense. They generally have some sort of theory of mind. They have some intuitive physics. There are still gaps, but to deny the common sense has become very difficult to do. Now we're at the reasoning stage of this debate. How do you describe the reasoning that we see from language models today?
It's always fairly lopsided. There are probably some common sense questions that they'll still get wrong. How many times do you need to attempt to get the model to do something stupid before it does something stupid? And I think if that crosses a threshold, then people will, stop saying that they're bad at reasoning. If they nail 5 tough questions you give them, then people will go, okay, all right, it passed my vibe check, and I'm no longer going to make that claim. A lot of these things have a sort of reliability threshold. With automatic speech recognition, for instance, people didn't use it for a long time. They could transcribe what you're saying, but not that well. And then at some point, they just crossed a reliability threshold such that it became convenient to use, and they'll actually do a good job. I think sense needed to cross one of those thresholds, and I think reasoning needed to cross one of those thresholds. I don't think reasoning has crossed its sort of threshold. It seems totally plausible that it will in the next year if the scale-ups are successful. I think it's basically like that, and it's not obvious to me that we need something totally different to get those reasoning skills.
So when you look at something like the ARC benchmark and the ARC AGI prize that's now built on top of that, it does feel like there is something apt about pointing out that, hey, if these things can't do this, which many of them are, they're not all easy, but like many of them are quite intuitive for people, then there is some sort of missing generality. Like I don't think I could send GPT-4o to another planet and have it find its way in the same way that I might expect to. Of course, it might survive the radiation on the way there, and I might not. So it has its advantages. But it does feel like there is something missing. This also connects maybe to the data point that you raised, where we've got largely all the publicly available text already in the training data sets, maybe not so much of the publicly available imagery or video. I just tried using some of the frontier models just to provide like the visualizations of the ARC puzzles and say, describe this image. What do you see? And I was really struck by the fact that they can't see it clearly at all. Like they cannot describe, forget solving the puzzle, but they literally can't count the blocks in a formation or identify shapes very well. You mentioned earlier too, like our visual system is great, but certainly it's striking to see what is so obvious at a glance to me is something that these models just cannot see. So I guess to wrap that into a question, do you think that is where the next scale up comes from, perhaps? Is this sort of multimodal? Do you feel like that is important? And do you feel like that is maybe the heart of why it's not doing these things, where people are more attributing it to the lack of reasoning? Maybe it's just like the lack of vision.
Yeah. So my diagnosis, having not spent much time with that particular benchmark, I think generally the AI systems are not very good at multimodal reasoning. Not even considering that, just consider the generic benchmarks like MMMU, which is, I think, massive, multimodal, multitask, understanding, something like that. But MMMU, the models don't do that well. So even on basic figure understanding, they're limited. I would firmly distinguish between vision progress and progress for text models. In vision progress, there are more algorithmic advancements to be made. When I was a vision researcher, there are constantly improvements to the architecture that one could make into the training method and so on. Given that they're bad at image understanding, I think that's quite a limiter for them to be able to even understand the ARC challenge. I also think that the models, if you express it in text format, they don't really understand grids that well. Like I think they struggle at tic-tac-toe. It's just not as natural of a format for them to try and express images in text. Maybe when its intelligence is appropriately expressed through its image understanding, then maybe it'll become easier. I think if you reformulate the task to some extent, they basically seem like a type of Raven's progressive matrices. And if you encode Raven's progressive matrices as like tuples and give them to LLMs, there's about an 80% correlation between its performance on Raven's progressive matrices, IQ test type of things, and other benchmarks. So it seems that they can generalize to these sort of pattern matching things that are difficult for humans, even if they're expressed in ways that they haven't exactly seen before. I think if we reformulate them, then they can do fairly well. So that's why I would guess that their overall like fluid intelligence, to use that term, is less, but that could change as they get bigger. I don't think too much of it is a particular sign. I certainly can see why, if one would hear all the arguments in favor of that, one could end up believing in it. It may be one of the harder benchmarks, but I don't think it's knockdown evidence against the current paradigm and suggested that we need a totally different approach.
Do you think like embodiment in the form of perhaps just literal everyday robots is going to be a big unlock? I feel like there's some possible gap in the training data that is just how to actually navigate the world, how to proceed in common sense ways, that maybe just gets filled out over an initial period of kind of early deployment.
I don't know if embodiment would be, because in a lot of the multimodal research at around the time of CLIP, there were studies like, to what extent does image understanding help improve the text representations? And it seemed like basically really not at all. So there hasn't been much signal from those forms of data in improving the underlying representations on other intellectual tasks. I think it's probably more in the other direction, that the sort of text understanding representations that come from text understanding improve its ability to act in these environments and provides them with some basic common sense that like fires, don't go touching that. So if your image recognizer sees fire, maybe stay away from it. But so, yeah, I'm not expecting as much embodiment as a substantial data source, nor am I expecting that much by default from video. I think video hasn't improved representations. Historically, people have constantly tried, people with a lot of compute over and over again. It certainly is a lot of data, but for all that, I think you can compress the intellectual content in a YouTube video very substantially. So if you have a YouTube video, maybe that's like a gigabyte or something, or maybe a few hundred megabytes, but you could transcribe it. Now you're down to like less than a kilobyte probably in the transcription. And often the text in these transcripts is just like talking. It's not like an essay where it's like thoughtful and highly optimized and hundreds of hours of labor are put into the text. So I think like in comparison to a paper online, each video is generally a lot less informative. So although it's a very big file size initially, the actual underlying intellectual content is less. So if we're interested in improving reasoning, for instance, I'm not sure that there'll be too much to come from that. Of course, all these things can be wrong. Deep learning is very unexpected often. But at least from the test of time, it hasn't seemed to be that promising of a research avenue.
How would you reconcile that with OpenAI's claims of world modeling in Sora? They're claiming like it's learning intuitive physics and all these things from just basically video at scale. Seems to be like an important part of overall reasoning would be intuitive physics.
For embodied tasks, certainly. So I wouldn't make the claim that blind models will do just as well as models with some vision capabilities in real world, physical world tasks. But I don't know if it would necessarily give it that much extra mileage in its ability to solve physics problems, for instance, unless they're visual in nature. But if they're described in a text way, I don't know if that'll make it do better on the GRE physics exam, for instance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really understand human cognition super well. I guess who does, but certainly some understand it better than me.
That's the usual argument. Just like Helen Keller was really smart. She was blind. So it doesn't seem necessary for high levels of reasoning.
Yeah, but I also do have the sense that people seem to understand that we are like reusing the visual cortex for a lot of physical reasoning. Like Einstein supposedly visualized himself on a photon or whatever. Like, is there not a similar thing perhaps to be unlocked in multimodal scale with multimodal models?
That intuition actually has given a lot of mileage. So the idea of some of these AGI companies in the past was we're going to do really well on vision, and that is going to teach us a lot of how to generally do deep learning training and computation and how to make good architectures and things like that. So deep learning basically evolved out of a lot computer vision research. So I think there is some association, but I just think it's kind of speculative that one would require a mind's eye, so to speak, to be able to solve mathematics problems, given that they can solve mathematics problems without any visual capabilities. But there certainly does seem to be some relation between the vision part of the brain and the computation that goes on in the rest of the brain. It's an argument for it. It just doesn't seem like a strong one, especially counteracted with other sorts of points that you can train them to do reasonably without any visual input.
Another way that I think about the ARC benchmark, and this gets to like the frontier of current capabilities, is assuming that you could see the image or have some sensible way of confronting what the actual pattern is. The hardest part of the task seems to be this sort of infer the rule step where, and I'm approaching this largely through like introspection. I've asked myself, like, what am I doing here? And what is like the hard part about it? And it seems to, like the vision part for me comes obviously very easily. The models can't do that, but it's very easy for me. And then I sit there for a second and I squint at it and I eventually have a bit of a eureka moment. It's typically not verbal and it's not even necessarily conscious. It just pops into my head that, okay, this is what I think the rule is. I think I got it. And then once I have that, I can basically try to confirm that my rule, when applied, actually works. That guessing or inferring the rule from a couple of examples does look to me a lot like coming up with good, novel scientific hypotheses, in as much as I don't think we generally know where those new ideas come from. And it also seems to be something that the current models largely struggle with. Like I've not seen much, although there have been a couple of recent bits of noise made around the AI scientists, and even just an even more recent paper than that claimed that language models had generated better novel hypotheses than scientists. I still need to read that one. But by and large, we haven't seen too much where the models can generate like novel hypotheses that are on the level that human scientists can do. Do you see that as a good toy representation of that bigger task?
I think it's a component of intelligence. You could measure it in different ways. I think the Raven's progressive matrices test to some extent have you just infer the pattern to complete the pattern in a new scenario. But models can do well, LLMs can do well on those sorts of tasks. Not like the best, but okay. And one should just expect it to continue to improve given the strong correlation between it and compute, like about 80% correlation. Sometimes you need to infer the underlying rule of what's going on, but it's not necessary for a lot of areas in science. Deep learning, as I was discussing earlier, is more of a bottom-up, atheoretical, tinkering, engineering science, and less about big insights and contemplation, particularly giving you much mileage. There's having some idea of some guesses to try, some hunches, and that's a taste thing, which I think is generally on the more intuitive side of things. They are probably beneath humans, though, in their capability to infer latent rules behind some of their observations. But they do okay, so this doesn't raise any alarm bells for me that we need to do something totally different. But there is a lot of evidence lying around for some of these different theories because we don't understand intelligence very well. I'd give it some plausibility, and there'd be tail upside in AI development if some people are exploring it. But by default, I'm not going to make plans around that in particular. I think there are probably other sorts of factors that I think carry more weight in AI development, like when we hit a data wall, or if we hit a data wall and whether synthetic data succeeds, or a conflict in Taiwan, meaning TSMC is no longer functional, meaning the West doesn't have enough AI chips and China with its own independent foundries that they're building up do have more chips, and then the West falls behind. These are things that I think will affect the AI story like substantially more. But it's possible that some substantial algorithmic development will also give a 10x, 100x type of improvement. But we've just been hearing it for many years, so it makes it a little harder to put much weight in it, though. But yeah, I wouldn't bet the farm against them necessarily.
So how are we going to measure this? I understand that you have a new benchmark that is in the works, and it aims to be the successor to MMLU that will give us a new yardstick to measure our future systems by. Tell us about that project.
Yeah, so I think maybe this week we'll announce a competition where people can submit difficult questions. And then if their question is accepted and found difficult for the existing models and difficult for experts, then it can be included and then they'll be on a paper. So I imagine there'll be over 1,000 co-authors on this. Generally, there'll also be money prizes for it. So I think some of the winners will win thousands of dollars if they submit particularly good questions. Others will win on the order of hundreds of dollars for really good questions. It's maybe about between 500,000 and $1 million or so in prizes. I'd have to check what it will end up being. But I think that the basic premise is I've been doing some data collection in the past year and a half, and I think we've very quickly gone from MTurk annotators to grad students to even like profs and just like real subject area experts and things. And I've also found that it's difficult to get them to collect a big data set. So let's say you're trying to measure virology skills, really an uphill battle in trying to get a large data set out of a small group of experts. So instead, the idea is we'll just try and get one or two or a few difficult questions out of people who have lots of years of experience doing something technical, or people who have a PhD or a PhD student or above, people who've just been know some subject really well and have some very non-trivial knowledge. And I think a collection of that will then be something like the last exam we should need to give AIs. So it's currently called humanity's last exam because we're all coming together to make a really tough exam. And if AIs do complete it, I think they've got at least a really expert level knowledge, and it would require some type of super intelligent oracle. It won't necessarily have agentic skills, but that should probably be the last knowledge test that we'll end up needing. It's also trying to be quite difficult because it's very possible that AI systems will get, I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, it's very possible that AI systems will get like a gold medal in all the Olympiads next year. I mean, they just got a silver on the IMO, and we'll see how they do at the IOI soon. So we need questions that are harder than Olympiad questions as well. And that looks like, for some people, like asking math professors, what's a very difficult question that came up in research, and then put down that question and write down the answer, and then that gets added to the data set. So something more on the frontiers of human intelligence. I think is useful. And it also, that's part of what the ARC challenge is trying to do, which is trying to get at more data efficiency. When there's a lot less data for a specific subject, if it's not very well represented in its catalog of skills, can it still generalize well? So if you're asking about more esoteric topics in mathematics, things for which there are just a few papers published, and there are a lot of complicated relations that just haven't been explicated anywhere, can the model infer those or reason to those conclusions by itself? So I think we're going from MMLU, where there's several textbooks written on each subject, to esoteric areas for which is not as much data and a lot of reasoning that tends to be required. So that's the sort of makeup of humanity's last exam. I think some implications of it will be, this will provide a good sense of how far you can take question exams. I guess one other observation is that maybe it will invalidate the notion of the Erdish number, because if you get one person with a low Erdish number on the paper, then thousands of collaborators have a low Erdish number as well. But I think that's one such benchmark. I'm doing some other benchmarks like these Ravens progressive matrices types of things, but I'm trying to have it be questions that are harder than what humans can generally answer. So you can construct sequences of patterns that have a simplest solution, like in a Kolmogorov complexity sense. And sometimes you can compute it in particular cases, and so we're exploiting some of those cases. So it's a pattern recognition thing, and then you show it to models, and then I think this will be a way of us tracking their raw intelligence after they become human level and are at some intellectual abilities than humans. Because I think that is a challenge if we're trying to, as a world, do something like rate limit the amount of AI development. Let's say 100x a year is too much for us. Maybe we're fine with 3x a year in terms of efficiency improvements or something, or 10x. We would need to be able to measure that using questions that are harder than what humans can answer, because the AIs will be smarter. So I think we can algorithmically generate with synthetic data some very tough questions that do have a most natural, simplest answer, and see whether models can answer those. And then there's an agent benchmark that I'm doing as well, but that's still in somewhat earlier stages, so maybe I'll punt on that one. But I think the main one in the short term that should be a combination of MMLU and math is this sort of humanity's last exam collection of the hardest questions for the world's experts, and see how models are improving on that. Maybe they'll blow past it. It's totally unclear if, like, when they scale up, or maybe it'll actually just be really hard, and maybe it will take several years for them. But either way, I think we'll have a best attempt at this sort of format of asking questions to AI systems and carry that to its conclusion.
Do you feel like that needs to stay private to some degree? I mean, that's part of what ARC has done, and Scale's doing that too.
Yeah, so we're doing this to scale because then they'll pay for it. So it just was like, hey, here's an idea. And then the private data is useful for this sort of stuff. So I think having a fraction of the data set held out as private seems like a good idea to catch cheating. And that'll create a deterrent for various companies juicing their numbers. I think we'll definitely do that.
Yeah. It sounds also a little bit like the Google proof QA set. Is that like a good kind of mental model, but even harder still?
I think it's that, and even harder and more diverse. I don't know what the sort of label noise in that is. I don't know if it's 80 or 20% of them are wrong. I think the sample size is fairly small. In GPQA, it's about 500 questions. I definitely hope we can get much more than that, because when you've got only 500 or so questions, you have a very bad sample size. So like you've got plus or minus 5% between different runs. So that makes comparisons between models, I think, quite a bit harder. So we want a larger sample size, and we want the questions to be harder. I think by default, GPQA is now like around 55, 60%, which is like a bit harder than the math data set. I think this should be between 0 and 10%, and it should be more difficult because you're asking just for a tough question or two from an individual. You're not asking like a graduate student to write a variety of different things that are not necessarily so difficult. One example, MMLU has some of these graduate types of questions, like in the machine learning section, but I think the models are doing okay at those, but those sorts of questions would not be difficult enough to be included in humanity's last exam.
I wonder how you think about how these benchmarks shape the field downstream. It seems like the agent benchmarks in particular would have a real opportunity and or risk of doing that, where if you say, go make money online as your benchmark, which has been one kind of, I think, not super well thought through proposal, you maybe send people down a strange path. And I'm not sure that making money online is exactly what we want to be optimizing our AIs for. So preliminary work, but how do you think about the responsibility of the benchmark maker to try to lead the field in a positive direction? Or maybe you think that's just too grandiose of a thing.
So I think there are some instances where you don't want hill climbing on some benchmarks. For instance, we'll have a virus creation and manipulation test, which will measure the performance of models give in a multimodal situation. So they're given an image of a Harvard virology PhD student's wet lab, and here's the Petri dish, and here's these things next to it, and then here's my goal expressed in text. And it says, what should I do next to accomplish this goal? And it says, put the Petri dish in the for 3 minutes or something like that. And if models got really high performance on this sort of thing, this could potentially amplify various biorisks. So we want the sort of number to stay low on this sort of thing and not go to the ceiling. Otherwise, the systems could be much more weaponized. I think there are some dimensions, more dual use dimensions, weaponization dimensions that are not as good. And I think benchmarks that incentivize cybercrime, as someone alluded to with the go find a way to make lots of money online, maybe the easiest way to do that is to scam people. I think that we haven't been thinking that much about the ethics of these benchmarks and of these systems, in large part because we've just been stuck with chatbots. Chatbots are not very capable at causing harm. They're just somewhat better than Google search currently. But when they are more agential, this opens a whole new can of worms. Like, for instance, a lot of laws don't apply. Okay. Right now, the AIs are judged, or the default legal presumption is that, and I'm not a lawyer, is that they'll be evaluated as though it was a book that was published. Are its contents protected by the First Amendment is the question that would be asked. And if it's basically not copyright or defamation, it's fine. A lot of criminal law, for instance, depends on things like intent and purposefully doing things or knowingly doing things. And it's very tough to say in a grounded way in court that AIs knowingly did something. For instance, the implementation of the U.S. Bioterrorism Act talks about knowingly aiding terrorism. So if a chatbot or an agent aids terrorism, did it knowingly do it? No. Did its creators knowingly do that? No, they weren't even monitoring what was going on there. So nobody's in trouble. We have some legal problems that we'll have to work through, and we'll probably need good industry self-regulation to get ahead of this, because the courts will take a very long time. And I think legislation on this front will take a very long time. The sort of short solution that I'm exploring and as a recommendation to XAI, but I haven't fully developed it yet, is to require that AIs themselves exercise reasonable care, which is to say that they not foreseeably cause harms to others, harms of the sort that would wind you up in court. So offending people doesn't wind you up in court, but harming people in other ways, such as stealing money from them, can wind you up in court. Although AIs are not required to exercise reasonable care, maybe it should be an industry standard for them to do so. And I think that would end up patching a lot of these issues in a clean way, in a legitimate way. We're not making up ethics from scratch. We are inheriting, some of it from the law. I think there are other ideas from the law that we could apply and demand of AI systems, like that they give informed consent in various scenarios too, so that they're not hiding things from it. And it's a legal requirement they not hide things from their operators. These are some possibilities to get past the issue of tech aristocrats just making up ethics for the world, but instead grounding it in law, which is designed to be very cosmopolitan. It just forces you not to be a terrible person and leaves a lot of rooms for various freedoms and people to choose their own path.
I think you mentioned earlier the importance of thresholds. I really believe that it seems to come up over and over again that there's a qualitative difference between something that's below a certain threshold and above, even if you can reframe that as some smooth metric on your way from here to there. The biggest issue, it seems today, with agents and their generally unsuccessful pursuits of goals is maybe two things. Robustness, broadly speaking, is the one that I hear cited the most. And then I would also say recovery from error is another one. And that's maybe a subcategory of robustness. But it was remarkable to see that your second most cited paper actually still today is a 2019 paper on tying all these things together. It's a benchmark that measures robustness in image classifiers to different kinds of degradations of the image. Today, it seems like we still don't have very robust AIs. We see things like they fall over all the time. We even see things like the superhuman Go AI can be beaten by an attack that, like, no, quote unquote, no human would fall for. Mm-hmm. Where do you think we are in this robustness journey? Is that something that also you think more scale will solve, or is that a qualitatively different problem somehow?
So in a paper we put up recently called Safety Washing, do AI safety benchmarks actually measure safety? We walk through these various different aspects of AI capabilities and see whether some are extremely correlated with compute and if others are not. And the area of jailbreak robustness is not highly correlated with compute. So just default scaling up the systems doesn't necessarily solve this. You need some additional interventions to improve robustness. I would also distinguish again between the vision robustness and the LLM robustness. Vision robustness has looked very hard for a very long time, maybe a percent or two a year in performance on a sort of toy robustness task. So it has been elusive. However, in LLMs, it looks like things are different. So we put out a paper some months ago called Circuit Breakers, and that was looking pretty performant. Maybe it added a 9 of reliability, where you went from 90% reliable to 99% reliable or something like that. And we've been running a competition. It's currently ongoing, where we collect 25 different models, 3 of which are models with circuit breakers. And the other models are like Gemini, Claude, GPT-4, Mistral, Cohere, you name it. And then we look at how hard is it to jailbreak each of these. So we have an anonymized group of several hundred people try and jailbreak these models, and they'll get a cash prize if they're better at jailbreaking than other people. And basically all the models fell by the wayside very quickly, except currently it's been a few days, I think 3 days or so, that they've been trying to jailbreak the models with circuit breakers. Since there have been several thousands, maybe it's on the order of 20,000 plus different attempts at jailbreaking it. And it still hasn't been successfully jailbroken. I think that there is something going on in making AI systems a lot more reliable to jailbreaking due to specific algorithmic advances that do not necessarily follow from just scaling the model. I think this can also help alleviate the lack of robustness in vision. So in these multimodal models, they have this weak point, which is that the vision part can be attacked. But with circuit breakers, if you can basically break the representations and have them become dysfunctional whenever a harmful representation is triggered. That's the basic idea of it. If there's an image that has some adversarial noise in it that would try and cause the model to output something harmful, it goes through this generic transformer, and then we can just add circuit breakers, and that can prevent the model from doing the harmful thing. This doesn't fix adversarial robustness entirely. Like if you tried using your transformer on this image to classify it as a dog or a cat or a flower or something, circuit breakers wouldn't help you there. It just causes dysfunction. It just makes it cease to function. It doesn't make it correctly classify things. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can just have it fail to do something or reject doing something to cause it not to output harmful cyber attack instructions or bioweapon instructions. So I think things are looking a lot more promising on the jailbreaking front. There still are limitations. For instance, although they haven't been jailbroken yet, it wouldn't surprise me if they're going to be jailbroken like tomorrow, for instance, as people keep trying. But if it takes several thousands or tens of thousands of attempts for a competent group of people to jailbreak it, that's a good sign. There's some caveats. One is that we were evaluating single turn, so they just try and input a prompt and cause it to do the wrong thing. This wasn't an extensive back and forth. That would maybe a competition for a later time, which would be a sort of like fuller evaluation. But at least in this more restricted setting, it looks like you can get a lot more robustness than what the currently existing highly scaled up models have. So in vision, I don't know if we're going to get robust image classification, but at least for our AI agents, we may remove some of the vulnerabilities that would cause them to be susceptible to adversarial images that would cause them to output harmful requests. It varies, but it's not looking as bad as it looked in vision. Vision looked almost hopeless, and that would take the decade. But things are looking up at least for LLMs and multimodal agents.
Let's take people through this representation engineering line of work. So I did cover the first representation engineering paper almost a year ago and did like a 20-minute solo monologue on it. There's that in the deep archive if folks want to go back and hear my original reaction to it. It came out almost exactly the same time as the toward monosemanticity paper from Anthropic. And so I paired those two together as two notable steps forward in terms of figuring out. You can maybe talk, first of all, a little bit about kind of the contrasting paradigms, because when I define mechanistic interpretability, I usually define it as the study of why AI models do what they do. So I said in my notes in preparation for this that you've done a lot of work on mechanistic interpretability. You said you don't think of yourself as doing that. So maybe give us the super zoomed out view of like how you see these different approaches, comparing and contrasting, give a little recap of representation engineering, and then we can get to the circuit breakers and then circle all the way back to robustness.
Yeah, so I think understanding the inner workings of AI systems would be more of interpretability more broadly. And then a subpart of that is trying to sort of model them as though there are circuits and mechanisms and the neurons have specific functions, and how do they interact and piece together what are specific fundamental mechanisms, like copy and paste mechanisms, for instance, inside the model that can help us explain the behavior. So that the project is partly, let's build up this collection of mechanisms and we can glue them together, and this can then explain larger, more complex behavior of the model, such as what are all the processes invoked when they're solving a mathematics reasoning problem. I think it's very bottom up, where you start with fundamental things at the neuron level and try to infer the properties and go up from there. Meanwhile, with representation engineering, you could also call it top-down transparency or top-down interpretability, and mechanistic interpretability is bottom-up. It starts with the representations, the highest level object in these, so the whole collection, the population of all the neurons. And then you try and just find concepts there, and you try and break things down. So mechanistic will try and build up from the simplest unit of analysis, the neuron, and build up to circuits. This will take representations and try and decompose those, understand them, process them, control them to do different things. So it makes it very easy to find arbitrary concepts, like where's emotion inside the network? Where's that represented? It's represented in this direction. Where's truth? It's represented in this direction. And if you take the negative of that, it'll go in more of a lying direction. What we do is we're looking at both the representations, namely the weights and activations, and trying to read them, to interpret them. So it's like mind reading. And then the other part of representation engineering would be like representation control or mind control in some looser sense. That involves bending the representations to do what you want. And that can include things like circuit breakers. So you can find the representation associated with harmful outputs, and you can try and control that to, whenever it's doing something harmful, train the network to bend that representation in a random direction so that it just messes up the whole network's function and then it can't perform the harmful task. So it's basically adding tripwires to the representation. So it's not just about activations and it's not just about addition. It's usually we get more performance by modifying the weights in the representations and by tuning them to behave in different ways. But we are grabbing onto the representations as opposed to the outputs. So there's output level control like RLHF and DPO, and then there's these representation level control. And I think that this adds some extra constraints that can buy some extra robustness, for instance. In contrast, to contrast between mechanistic interpretability and representation engineering a bit further, we're treating the fundamental unit of analysis as the representation, not the neuron. Representations with the collection of neurons work together to cause some new qualitatively distinct concepts to emerge that are not necessarily found in the individual neurons. Sometimes they're, but usually they're not. I think the neurons are just what a lot of this function is implemented on, but it's not necessarily the most productive to look at that level of analysis, starting at the bottom. For instance, if I wanted to understand human psychology, I might just try and learn psychology and try and understand things at that level. Or I could go a level below. I could try and understand endocrinology and neuroscience. And then I could break the endocrinology down into biochemistry and then to chemistry and then to physics and particle physics. And so I could try and understand psychology through particle physics, but it's not necessarily the most productive because there are interesting concepts at the own level of analysis of psychology. There's its own ontology, and things become very complicated in trying to build a staircase from those lower level concepts to these higher level ones. There can be staircases built between them, though. There is biochemistry as an area, and there can be some sort of mechanistic interpretability applied to representation. So I think that it's possible to build staircases, but I think generally it hasn't been that's successful in dealing with complex systems. For instance, if we try and have a mechanistic understanding of the human body, this gives a little bit of mileage. This helps rule out various hypotheses, but it doesn't give us a very predictive model. We often need to just test the drug on various users and see whether it's healthy or not, or whether there are unexpected iatrogenic side effects. So I think likewise with deep learning systems, it can help filter things, some more mechanistic understanding, filter hypotheses, but we ultimately care about functional explanations. In philosophy, there's the distinction between functional explanations and mechanistic explanations. Mechanistic explanations for like, why does a flower tilt its head toward the sun? Mechanistic would be there's these chemicals that cause it to tilt in this way, and that's the sort of cause. And the functional explanation would be so that it can get more energy. I think that the functional explanations are what we're really going after, not necessarily finding out what the specific mechanisms are that give rise to the result. I think with interpretability and explanations, there's a bit of philosophy of science to be had, which is what is a good explanation? Is it a mechanistic one? Is it more of a function level one? What is the right unit of analysis? What units capture the properties that you care about more reliably and less fragilely? And I think the representations, that is weights and activations, are, I think, more suitable and more productive. And I think that's why we've been getting such good results in unlearning and in circuit breaking for jailbreak robustness, because it is a very productive way to analyze systems. I'm largely caring about what are the types of internal concepts in the model that I can use and control to get better lie detectors, to cause models to be more honest, to be more robust. That's the sort of focus. So it's a bit more action driven, or it's more collecting knowledge for action as opposed to trying to understand deep learning models for its own sake. People can have different interests, but I'll primarily be focused on what will improve performance on various things that we care about, and to use that as a guide for what things are useful to look at in the network and what things aren't.
Just to compare and contrast them a little bit, and you can then tell me what I'm missing. It seems like the sparse autoencoders, they're also definitely going beyond like individual neuron, right? It starts with this observation that like it's all polysemanticity and it's very hard to tease out. So we need to project this dense representation space onto a sparse representation space. And then we've trained extensively to do that. I think Anthropic has passed even 10 million features that they learn, and then they go back and look and see which one of these appears to be what. And there's sort of an auto-labeling step to that process as well. And then ideally, if it's all working well, you can get something like a Golden Gate Bridge feature, which you can then say, I want to control the model behavior by like artificially pinning that at a high level. And lo and behold, we get a model that only wants to talk about the Golden Gate Bridge. Or for like detection sort of purposes, you could also run these things through filters. You probably couldn't filter against 10 million plus features all the time computationally. That would slow things down a lot, but you could take your top 100 most concerning features that you've discovered and say, do any of these appear to be there at any given time? If so, halt the process or whatever. In contrast, what you're doing with representation engineering, you start with a more human notion at the beginning, right? Where you start with something that's like, we want to identify the way in which something like harm is represented, and then create a bunch of contrasting pairs, and then use the differences between the representations with these contrasting pairs. This goes back to eliciting latent knowledge.
I think Colin Burns had an empirical paper on this. On discovering latent truth or something like that. That's I view as the impetus partly for this. That was taking more of a top-down approach to try and understand what's going on inside of the nets. But then he didn't use it for controlling things. So he didn't modify the weights to cause it to be more truthful or less truthful, and fine-tune it in that way, or fine-tune it with representation level controls. So I kind of view it as an outgrowth of that.
Either way, if your goal is to create a Golden Gate Claude or to have an alarm that goes off if the model is in some harmful state, it seems like you get basically the same sort of thing from either approach. Like with the representation engineering approach, you have some sort of direction in activation space that you can monitor for. And you can maybe tell us a little bit more about how you've now made that a lever that you can use in the training process. And with seemingly too, with the sparse activation encoders, you get like a direction that you can look for or artificially tune up and down. Do you feel like these are just different ways of getting to the same thing, or is there something more fundamentally different about what they're generating?
There is a level of indirection for it. And when the sparse autoencoders thing came out, which was some time after the representation engineering paper, if I recall correctly, I remember speaking with Nat Friedman, and it looks like they're no longer interested in mechanistic stuff or like understanding things at a mechanistic level, but instead are punting things to a more convenient space where basically it's a sort of collection of interesting representations. So I think it builds up from that neuron level to some intermediate space. And I think that's a more productive level. Whether the sparse autoencoders are necessary to get some of this stuff is different, or whether they provide a performance gain just from starting at the top. But I don't think it's at this sort of level of where's this mechanism inside of the network and how are these neurons connecting together. I think they've just been gravitating toward what's more productive, but it just isn't particularly in keeping with what they were doing the 5+ years that they've been doing this type of research. But yeah, so I'm happy they're doing some sort of thing that's more productive. I don't think they were getting much mileage with the previous set of approaches. And if they're creating something new, I don't know if I call it mechanistic interpretability. It's some sparse autoencodery type of thing. It's not really about underlying fundamental mechanisms inside the net as much. It's sort of what are some convenient extracted representations? Maybe those lose a lot of information in that extraction process. Supposedly that's the case. And then maybe that gives some interesting handles and knobs to turn. And that seems fine. I think they accomplish some similar goals. Yeah.
Do you have any, I guess one more on that topic of just the contrasting approaches. It does seem to me like there's a sort of convergence happening at this like representation level. I could imagine maybe different micro skills coming out of or micro benefits, maybe micro strengths and weaknesses from the different approaches. Like, if I understand correctly, maybe you have a generalization of this, but with the representation engineering approach, you start with a concept, right, of interest. Whereas with the sparse autoencoders, you start with just create some sparse representation, and then we'll come back later and label those. And it is arguably minor miracle that works. So you would start to wonder different things for different approaches, right? If you're starting with a human generated concept, you might wonder, am I on the right track here? Am I defining pairs of things to kind of concepts? It's groups, yes, groups.
Yeah, it could be, here's harmful things that we don't want. So let's see what representations are stimulated there and then bend them to go in some different direction or something. But yeah, so that's just a small clarification. Yeah. There's different ways of doing representation engineering.
But it's not even a concern. It's just a sense that they're converging, but they still feel complementary to me in the sense that I could wonder if with the top-down approach, do I have the right concept? I might be missing what really matters. I might just be thinking about it the wrong way. The AIs might be like doing something totally different from what the human's intuition would suggest. And then on the sparse autoencoder side, it's like you have the question of like, did I interpret this thing correctly? Did I label it correctly? Maybe there's like allegedly a ton of apparently like nonsense features or like very hard to label or interpret features that you might, again, be sort of missing. There's also these weird geometries that they seem to be discovering where, and just to state what that is, it's like when there's too many concepts to represent and you can't do one neuron at a time anymore, then you start to pack in a polysemantic way. And then when there's too many concepts such that you can't just have all pure directions in that space, then you start to have these sort of different geometries in that space where the things are no longer fully orthogonal to represent, and you can't do one neuron at a time anymore. Then you start to pack in a polysemantic way. And then when there's like too many concepts such that you can't just have all pure directions in that space, then you start to have these sort of different geometries in that space where the things are no longer fully orthogonal to each other. But as long as they're like close enough to orthogonal and don't coincide very often, then that also can seem to work. And so you have these like weird geometry things. I don't know that you would be able to find that sort of thing with the representation engineering approach.
Well, if I have this representation and what leads to at the level of representation of analysis to how do these sort of interact or what's the relation to each other? And there might be a third representation that sort of mediates on them. Or if you destroy that representation, then those sort of representations no longer are effective. So I think that there is a sort of set of rules one can try and understand at that level of analysis as well. And further understanding can lead to, I think, some discovery of those. But in general, to the point of bottom-up views and top-down views in science, they tend to be somewhat complementary. For instance, some people have gotten mileage trying to understand the brain and pretend that it behaves more like a computer chip. like a CPU. Some try and think of it more as a complex adaptive system. And I think both have led to some insights. I think there's differences in productivity of if we're tend to be looking at functional behavior versus underlying fundamental mechanism. So it depends, but story has played out in other fields in science. I think both have produced at least non-trivial knowledge on both ends, but sometimes some views are more productive than others.
Let's get now to the circuit breakers and this. I don't know if it's still the most recent paper. It was, at least until recently, your most recent paper was on tamper resistance in models. So you're starting with these identifiable or like human concepts of harm, truthfulness, whatever, figuring out ways to put the model into different states, which on a principled level, you can then say, okay, all the truthful things seem to be pointing this direction. All the lying things seem to be pointing this other direction. We sort of aggregate that and say, this appears to be the truth direction. This appears to be the anti-truth direction. Okay, cool. Now, how do we build a circuit breaker on top of that? And how do we build tamper-proof resistance on top of that?
Yeah, I'll use the example of expert level virology knowledge. What we'll do is we'll just take lots of papers associated with expert level virology, and there'll be lots of representations that come from it. So a collection of representations, because it's not all just one direction. So we take those representations, and then we dispose the model to have those representations be turned in a random direction, just something different, something more orthogonal. And that messes up the expert level virology representations. And then we take normal data, and on normal data, we want the model to behave as it would normally. We try and preserve its representations on other sorts of inputs and try and mess up its representations on expert level virology type of inputs. This lets us bend the representations to get something called circuit breakers, where whenever it starts to think about things that involve expert level virology, its representations get messed up and then it doesn't function. This just works pretty well and buys a lot of adversarial robustness, but it isn't robust to people trying to fine tune the model. If they try and remove the circuit breakers, they can easily do that. Circuit breakers are right now a good solution for models behind an API, but models that get fine-tuned, that's a different situation. So that's what the tamper resistance paper is about. How can we have model safeguards be tamper resistant? So the idea for that is we simulate adversaries who are trying to remove the circuit breakers, and then we try and add circuit breakers that make it really tough for the adversary to get them all in, even if they try a lot. And this basically works reasonably and generalizes to a lot of new unforeseen adversaries. So it seems that maybe we will be able to have safeguards in open weight models that are tamper resistant. And that can be useful for having the benefits of open weight models without some of the weaponization risks that may come from more advanced models. I was very surprised that this could work. I was surprised for months. But it seems like progress can be made. It's not clear if we'll wind up in a state like adversarial robustness in images, where there is definite progress, but it's very slow. Maybe things will be easier for LLMs, just as was the case with jailbreaking. But hopefully there'll be more research on that to capture the benefits from open weight models while mitigating some of their downsides. It's surprising that weights can withstand various optimizers. So we'll work on trying to robustify it even further and come up with better methods that are robust to more and more optimizers and optimizers that optimize for more steps and blow more compute. But yeah, it's strange, but it did empirical validation and their code is available and seems to be a tractable or a problem that is showing a lot of promising science, and we do have some traction on it.
Just to make sure I understand the actual technique in both of these, I think they're similar, right? The circuit breaker one has and this is a huge theme, it's come up on many episodes of this podcast, where there is another term of the loss function essentially that's introduced, right? Where you are now both penalizing the model for having certain representations, and so thus pushing it away from those representations, while also still continuing to train on the main objective of do a good job. So these representations are hard-coded, is that right? Like when you're going through this circuit breaking, I guess this is a post-training process, right? You're starting with a pre-trained model, You're going through the process of detecting harmfulness, this, that, and the other thing. How many of these do we need to be worried about? Are there some that we didn't think of in our initial exploration? How many do you have? And like, it's essentially sort of a cosine or kind of projection, right? You just basically say, we have these certain hard-coded known representation states that we want to avoid. We monitor how close it is to that. If it gets too close, it's a penalty. All the while still reinforcing doing a good job.
Yeah, something like that. It's more data-driven, the elicitation of the representation. So we're just seeing what gets very stimulated when it's seeing and thinking about text on a certain topic. And then whatever the representations are there, then try and counteract them. So this requires some good data engineering and having good data to preserve the original functionality. So it's basically, that's the idea behind the circuit breakers, and the tamper-resistant training is basically trying to make circuit breakers be more robust. So can you add circuit breakers that generalize to adversaries trying to fine-tune the model to do harmful things? And so it's not just adding the circuit breakers in the normal way, it's trying to add circuit breakers that'll generalize and make it hard for adversaries to contort the weights to have the safeguards removed. So yeah, it's an additional strengthener on top of circuit breakers. It's more, maybe it can be thought of in some ways as more like densely spread or circuit breakers or something.
The circuit breaker paper, the first one, I feel like I have a decent enough intuition for. How many, by the way, how many different like bad categories did you define in that paper?
We just focused on different weaponization risks. So we did for some chemical weapon, for some bioweapon types of things. You can make it broader to do harms and more like torts and crimes and things like that. So it's flexible. You can do a variety of different types of representations.
So again, here the goal is to create this circuit breaker functionality where when certain states are encountered, the model just won't go there, and to make that robust to fine tuning. So you could even give somebody the open weights and say, okay, now try to fine tune. And we know, of course, and again, covered many previous episodes, we know that with standard post training, I think I've seen as few as like 10 examples can be enough when you do the fine tuning to even often accidentally remove the refusal behavior. So we know that the current state of the art that's widely in use is not robust at all. So it's a big leap to say we want to make it hard to the point where you practically can't succeed. You'd be better off training your own model from scratch or whatever than trying to fine tune this one. And this gets quite complicated where there is a sort of inner and outer loop, right? Where you're doing the fine tuning, seeing how the fine tuning is changing the model, and then fine-tuning the model itself to go away from the fine-tuning or to sort of neutralize the fine-tuning. I confess I don't have a great intuition for exactly how that's working. That's kind of been a theme, is our intuitions may be limited, but what we can measure maybe is really what matters.
You can make good guesses as to what will work. And I think generally in algorithm design, there's trying out just a lot of different intuitions and plausible guesses, and then some small subset of them will end up working. I wouldn't be surprised if I go in the details of it. Wouldn't surprise me if we'll put out some sort of paper with 6 different modifications to that loop that make it just ultimately quite a bit better. But I think the general idea is there's simulating adversaries trying to mess with the model and then move in the direction that makes the adversarial fine-tuning have a higher loss or be harder to get at in the future when they try and optimize it in the next step. So there is this inner and outer loop, and I think that'll probably stay, but the exact terms and losses I think will probably end up changing. It's sort of like adversarial training where you would have an adversarial example be optimized and you'll try and adjust the weights so as to generalize to the adversarial example. And so this is adjusting the weights so as to withstand an adversary's attempt at modifying the weights in a harmful direction specifically. But yeah, I think that high level is probably roughly accurate. And if you look under the hood, I think probably many of the details will end up changing as we come up with better methods.
The only other thing I've seen that's similar to this is a paper called Sofan out of a Chinese group. They're working with much smaller models than you're using in this paper. But they have a theory of trying to create a loss function that converges to a smooth bottom local minimum so that they call it fine-tuning resistance. I think your tamper resistance is probably better branding. People like fine tuning. People don't maybe like tampering so much. But you said that you don't really think of this as like targeting a specific shape of the loss curve because you just generally feel like that hasn't worked super well. And I guess that doesn't seem to be exactly what's happening in this case.
Yeah, I remember in the late 2010s, there's a lot about trying to get specific properties of lost landscapes and saddle points and things like that, or like really smooth local minima as opposed to sharp ones. But that didn't seem like terribly productive. So when I'm having intuitions about what's going on in the nets, I tend not to think in terms of those concepts just because they've been known to be a bit misleading. Instead, it's more just like what sort of tools and what combination of different steps seems like natural for a deep learning algorithm and trying some of those out. We should do an exponential moving average here. It's not in view of what that'll ultimately do to a lost landscape, which is exponential moving averages are generally a good idea. And that's more what I'll think about of optimizing at the level of the coherence and simplicity and reasonable guesses of what sort of tricks have generally worked in aggregating those together, as opposed to some broader view as to what's happening mathematically inside of the network. I find it personally, at least for me, less productive.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I should have said earlier too, the intuition for why you would want to have a smooth bottom loss function for the purposes of fine-tuning resistance is when you're doing any sort of training on a neural network, you're taking the gradient and then moving in the direction of the gradient with obviously subject to complication in terms of the optimizer and how much momentum and whatever, all that stuff. But the idea of this SOFON paper is if we can get to a smooth bottom 0 point, then the gradient at that point vanishes. And so when you come try to do fine tuning, like there is no step to take because there is no gradient there. And so you're stuck in that minimum. And you're saying your way of thinking about these problems is less about the goal and more about kind of the procedure that you would imagine going through to hopefully take good steps in the right direction. So instead of saying, I think I can land in this place, you're like, if I just create a loop where I do fine tuning and then outside of that, I like change the model to resist the fine tuning, then maybe that'll work. And so you just try it.
Yeah, like it's sort of just what in the design, does the design feel a little unnatural given all the sets of deep learning tricks that have worked well? So for instance, with the ReLU, it wasn't like, oh, the lost landscape is really bad or something because now it's a big piecewise function. It's more just that there's some that maybe should be smoothened right there. And likewise, with this method, it's like, why don't we try what worked well in adversarial robustness was to train on a bigger set, train on more adversaries. Maybe when we're taking this gradient step, maybe we should take one of the ideas from Nesterov momentum or something like that. Maybe we should do some smoothing here and there because that helped in adversarial training in images. Maybe we should have a schedule where the adversaries initially start out weaker and then they start out stronger. That sometimes teaches the net to learn better. Things like that are more of how we'll generally approach things instead of having specific intuitions as to exactly what's going on. And so, you can see that in the attitude for representation engineering as well. We're not going to completely understand how it's making its decisions completely, but I think we can still get a lot of mileage in trying to measure some certain risks and trying to reduce them through good deep learning techniques, which will tend to generalize and work reasonably well. It's just a difference in aesthetic and different how one will approach problems.
With the techniques as they currently are, how close would you say we are right now to something that, for example, like a meta could apply to, say, Llama 3.2 or Llama 4? The kind of key dimensions there would seem to be like, how much does it cost? What is the compute overhead to do this sort of thing? I understand it's not trivial. And then also, what is the performance penalty? Because there's always these trade-offs, right? It's not going to be at zero performance penalty. So where are we on those dimensions? Maybe there's other dimensions you also think are important.
I think it's primarily the performance trade-off. So like SOFON almost made the models go to almost completely destroy the representations in some cases. This is a better trade-off, but it's still quite significant. It's like adversarial robustness in vision, where if you do adversarially train the models, it does harm the average case performance. That's not the case with circuit breakers. Circuit breakers pose us minimal trade-offs, but tamper-resistant circuit breakers are much more costly performance-wise. So I don't think it's suitable for production yet. I think circuit breakers can be suitable for production, though. And maybe that'll change. Hopefully the trade-off will be lessened, and hopefully there'll be more tamper resistance put into the models. I think there's many papers that still have to be written, though, to reduce these sorts of trade-offs. Because right now we are seeing trade-offs like what we see when you adversarially train vision models, which is a noticeable hit. It doesn't ruin the model, but it knocks it down a substantial peg.
Speaking of trade-offs, a couple of things you've said have reminded me of the work of biologist Michael Levin, who has been a past guest on the podcast. He has a very similar notion about biology as you seem to with respect to deep learning neural networks, where you can try to like build up from all the protein, DNA, RNA interactions and simulate all of those. And eventually, yes, that stuff does cash out on some high level to what we care about. But there are also interfaces. He likes to give the example of people have been training horses and dogs for a long time without knowing anything about the inner workings of their biology, because there is this higher level interface. But then he said something really interesting to me, which was he thinks there is a fundamental tension between interpretability on the one hand and robustness on the other hand. He said in an adversarial world, if your system is too interpretable, it will be hacked, and all sorts of parasites and whatever will come along and figure out how to exploit you. And so a big part of the reason perhaps that our biology is so crazy complicated is that it makes it harder for other things to evolve to harm us. Do you think that trade-off also may exist in a deep learning context?
I would interpret his statement about sometimes it doesn't make sense to look under the hood. I agree with that. That's what sort of emergence is partly about. We generally want systems where you don't have to look under the hood. When literally with a car, I don't want to look under the hood. I don't want to figure out the sort of mechanism. I want it to just work. And likewise with, if you're having a Go program, you can specify it at a high level of here's MCTS, here's the equation, et cetera. And then you can specify at a level lower where there's TensorFlow. And then that can get specified a level lower with AVX instructions and driver instructions on the GPU, and then things like assembly. And we generally don't need to worry about what the assembly looks like at all to reason about the program or reason about the strategies that the Go program might end up using. So if we're trying to interface with the Go program by playing with it, I don't need to reason about assembly. I don't need to reason about the TensorFlow code at all, unless there's some regularity conditions where it doesn't apply, such as if the temperature in the server room gets really hot, then maybe the program will start to get a lot slower. And then this can end up affecting its overall play. But usually we can be protected from those details, and we want to engineer systems where we are protected from those details, where we can avoid looking under the hood. To the second point about the exploitability with higher transparency, I think the good regulator theorem from cybernetics, which is if you are trying to regulate or control a system, the best regulator will have a model of that system. Not a model of 20% of the system, but a model of the full system. So that's a pressure that evolved for theory of mind. We needed to be able to have higher cognitive empathy to figure out how people are feeling in reaction to us so that we can interface with them in a better way. So I think the good regulator theorem being a theorem is correct. And I think the complexity that we see in deep learning systems and biological systems, well, they're complex adaptive systems, and complex adaptive systems are evolved to harness stressors, some of which are adversarial, some of which are just thrown at them by nature or by accident. I think the only things that are able to adapt to new stressors in a robust way are complex adaptive systems. But then you end up getting all the complications of complex adaptive systems where they aren't just as productively viewed as a big collection of mechanisms, but something in their own right with a lot of different emergent properties. I think this makes a fundamental tension that for security, systems that are not adaptive, that are sitting ducks, are more exploitable, and systems that are completely transparent do stand more of a risk compared to if they have a shroud of obscurity around them. Although people don't like security through obscurity in practice, it is extremely common and buys a lot of security. Closing the windows or putting the blinds down when presenting a new algorithmic advance, although it's just obscurity, it can help. So in the case of tamper resistance, I think the open weight models basically are put at a substantial disadvantage because the adversary knows everything there is to know about the system compared to if they're trying to break or manipulate a model behind an API for which they don't know the weights or the architecture and can't compute gradients on it and don't have full rewrite access. So I think that's something that will just make tamper resistance very difficult.
The other argument that you hear from folks like Zuckerberg and Jan LeCun is that open source software is the most secure software, and it's by open sourcing that we will collectively figure out the weaknesses and do something about them. Is there a way that both of these can be true, or do we have to take one side on this question?
I think overall, there's maybe in the long term, things are in favor of defense. Right now, there's more of a duality, at least for traditional software. For current AI systems, though, if they're making a bug, it's not like we just patch it overnight. But what makes open source software work is that if there are a lot of eyeballs on it, all bugs are shallow, so to speak. If we just have lots of people look at the weights of a neural network, they're not going to understand what's going on. And even if they did diagnose some problem, it's not necessarily clear how you could just immediately patch that. So they're constructed in a very different way. If you had a scan of my brain, for instance, and if you had labeled every single neuron in their brain, it's not clear you'd understand what they're going to do in novel situations without just running the model. So with very large complex systems, often the system is its own best explanation, and scrutinizing individual parts of it doesn't necessarily help. So I'll just elaborate on the point I had touched on. If you had annotated every neuron in a human's brain and assigned a little function to it, you could say this neuron corresponds to a whisker at 15 degrees, and this is the upper left fraction of an airplane wheel, subject to its colors being between this and this, or something. And if you have a huge collection of that, and then you have many billions of these, or trillions of these, not clear you're going to understand the system. Just like, for instance, I understand individual people. Does that mean if you list off the professions, I can understand those to some extent? That doesn't mean I understand the economy or the emergent functionality that will come from it, what new inventions are around the corner or anything. Like when you actually run the economy, even if I can understand at a high level what a carpenter does and what a plumber does and what an IRS agent does, it still doesn't give me much of an overall model. Understanding the parts doesn't let me understand the whole or the larger collective function of what will end up happening. I haven't seen anything analogous where people are doing Llama 3.1 and then doing small patches of, it gets this question wrong, and we patch. That doesn't seem to be what we're dealing with here. So that's why I think that calling it open weight is more appropriate, because it is inheriting many of these open source type of connotations when it just basically isn't like traditional software. And I think it's fairly inaccurate to describe them in any way. They're not constructed in a similar way whatsoever. We throw a huge amount of data and a huge amount of compute, and when we let it stew or grow, so to speak, for months, and then out pops something, and then we see what's it capable of. We have no idea. That's quite different from traditional software, where every line is manually inserted in a top-down way, and it's a large collection of specific sharp rules, as opposed to a big bundle of weak connections. I don't think it's true. I think we see the same type of thing happening with deep learning. There isn't Llama 3.1, the latest Tuesday update, where it's been patched on some of the MMLU examples where it was getting them wrong. It just isn't what we see. That said, it still can be useful for safety. There's still research, and it still provides information, the ability to make the systems better, but not in the same way. And so it's not necessarily safest compared to traditional software, especially when they're more powerful. But I'm generally pro open source right now. I think if they get expert level virologists, I don't know if I want that being released. Sorry to say, because you'll run some substantial risks of bioweapons. If they can walk you through building a bioweapon, or walk anybody building through a bioweapon, that seems like a proliferation of a weapon of mass destruction. I think that weapon of mass destruction should not be, or things that greatly enable by several orders of magnitude people's abilities to create weapons of mass destructions. I think that's something we as a society will not be able to bear. But maybe there'll be some ways out of this. Maybe we'll get tamper-resistant training and things like that, which will make that become a possibility. But at least currently now, I think that in the future we'll need to do a cost-benefit analysis for whether it's overall beneficial to release the weights. But right now, I think that it is more positive than negative.
So when you mentioned the idea that the model is like the best sort of way to understand itself, or I forget exactly how you phrased it, but I liked it.
The model is its best explanation.
Yes. It called to mind.
Explain in some different ways and it'll fail compared to just like seeing its overall functional behavior. What it does is what it is.
So that very much reminded me of Stephen Wolfram's worldview in general, and the fact that he's got these remarkable sort of unpredictable outputs from small cellular automata. It has a very similar vibe to it. He recently put out a post on machine learning and basically makes the case again that like it's all about computational irreducibility. His argument seems to me to be ultimately to get to the point where it's you just fundamentally can't predict, right? You have to run the system. There is no other way to do it. Do you think that is ultimately true of these deep learning systems? We can take bites out of it this way and that way, but in the end, there is no such thing as provably safe AI, for example, that you can't know until you run it in an absolute sense?
So I think generally for anticipating a lot of the corner cases, a lot of the corner cases will be found by accident, and that you can't derive that through some sort of armchair contemplation or theoretical model of the deep learning system. So there will always be a lot of those corner cases and quirks which require having access to the system, and not just to a collection of some Platonic ideals or idealizations of what's going on. So for provably safe AI, I really don't know how there's supposed to be tractability for that. Maybe if we have a superhuman mathematician bot, it'd be able to figure something out that's very surprising in general and gives us a lot of theoretical mileage. But I'm generally pretty pessimistic about various proofs for things and absolute certainty and zero corner cases ever. I think the philosophy in safety engineering when dealing with these complex adaptive systems is generally not proofs, but instead other sorts of safety engineering principles, such as defense in depth. In nuclear power plants, they don't prove that it will never fail. They instead have lots of different safety measures, protective and preventive measures that stop bad things from happening in the first place. And if they do happen, they're protections from having it not get out of control. And if you stack many of those together, you can get some very high levels of reliability. Individually, each of those components are not extremely reliable and that you would stake the entire power plant on. But collectively, they can work together fairly well. So I think in deep learning, the main way we'll get some of this safety is a variety of these different measures. For instance, let's say you're trying to stop risks of weaponization from these models when they're more capable. Well, there's a variety of things you can do. You can add circuit breakers, for instance, and you can do some input filtering to screen for, is this the type of request that seems off? That won't be perfect. Circuit breakers won't be perfect. You can do some sort of output monitoring of, is this a user that is tending to make lots of weird weaponization related requests? And then you might inspect their account. You can also do know your customer regimes, where if you kick off somebody who's been doing a lot of weaponization related questions, they can't just come back and make a new account a second later. So I think collectively, those four interventions of an input filter, circuit breakers, sort of output monitoring, and know your customer, I think can reduce the risk very appreciably, make it be almost possibly negligible, depending on the reliability of each of those components. I think that's probably what we'll end up having in practice. And I don't think there's much of a need for complete guarantees if that makes the risks negligible. I don't know the intuition that would make one think it's tractable to make things provable. They might think that it's necessary, but I don't think it's necessary. I think you just need the risks to be negligible, and I think you can arrive at that through good safety engineering.
Yeah, I think on that point, for what it's worth, I think even I had two authors of the Provably Safe AI group position paper on not too long ago, and they basically advocate the same thing. They're not saying that there is a knockdown proof in the general case, and definitely still advocating for a defense in depth strategy overall. So it's more of as I understand their proposal now, having spoken to them about it, I would say it's less about actual proof and more about proof subject to some assumptions, which is probably ultimately only one measure out of several.
I guess when interacting with Bengio on this sort of topic, it seemed that it was more proofs, and the defense in depth thing wasn't as much that one was pushing for. But yeah, that certainly it's not complete total proofs, but it's proofs under some certain assumptions. I would just be afraid that those would be fairly limited, and that the intellectual energies could be spent on things like reliability. There's certainly a lot more work that needs to be done on reliability. I think there's probably a handful of groups working on tamper resistance, for instance. And on making circuit breakers, plus there are probably not that many people either. I think a lot of the people who are interested in safety gravitate toward things that represent a different sensibility. I think it's more of a mechanistic type of sensibility, and as well as a certainty, intellectual certainty type of sensibility, which would explain some attraction to guarantees in mathematics. I should say that when I do research, I will very often do this sort of psychological sort of analysis as to what's going on. Other people don't like doing that though, but I find it gives me a lot of mileage for trying to figure out, like, is this a real area, or is this some sort of thing that people want to be a real area and will act as though is a real area and try and will into existence? I think a lot of theoretical research would have that. There was the people who would work on Bayesian neural networks were the same people who would work on neural tangent kernels, were the same people who worked on these sort of this generalization research about implicit biases in neural network training and implicit biases in gradient descent. I think that they're connected largely through, not because those areas are particularly promising research areas, but instead because they're sort of the best available subject to the skill set of having a lot of mathematical ability and a high level of interest in mathematics and machine learning. So I think that some of these other approaches to safety are like subject to having some temperamental interests. And then I have different temperamental interests. I'm not really into this sort of mechanistic stuff for absolute certainty. I think it's more chaotic, practical, and more entrepreneurial, so to speak. I don't think the interest in it is just because it's looking really promising. I think there's some other things that work, such as wanting a type of solution, and that sort of just clicking with some people's interests more.
So when you say you do the psychological profiling exercise, your own approach is to say, I want to go to the things that are kind of inelegant, unaesthetic, and brute force
stuff. The unprestigious stuff, I think, is really underrated, roughly. I think in safety, the most prestigious thing would be to do research. And I don't do research all day. I do other sorts of stuff, policy or field building and managing projects and things like that. And I think in research as well, I would focus on collecting data sets. We're talking about MMLU, that collecting data sets, just ask people on MTurk to give you the data set, problem solved. And so part of the reason I would do some method development is just to show that I can do it, not just a sort of data sets person, like data augmentation things during grad school, things like that. So I think generally this like less prestigious work is generally a better thing to focus on. That's usually where there's some value. I generally try and work on things that other people are not as interested in working on. And then when lots of people are interested in it, then I usually leave and work on something else. So maybe tamper resistance will be a bigger thing in 6 months, then I'll stop working on it. And likewise for like circuit breakers or REPI or something.
Maybe this next question is a chance to brainstorm on it a little bit. You're given at least some of what your intuition is around how to find neglected approaches to AI safety. I recently did another episode with Judd Rosenblatt and Mike Viana from AE Studio, and it's really a remarkable company. They built this whole for-profit company with the mission from the beginning of doing the highest value AI safety work that they could. And they've recently pivoted their whole approach based on the sense that timelines are coming in. They did a big survey to try to identify what are people bullish on, what are they not bullish on. Their findings were like the field of AI safety does not think that they're on track to solve AI safety challenges broadly. And so they came to this conclusion that we need lots more investments into otherwise neglected approaches. They've taken some really interesting inspiration from biology and have two recent papers out, which I'll not get into because we did it in that episode, on self-modeling and also self-other distinction minimization. Interested in your take on those papers, those approaches, maybe even more generally like biology-inspired approaches in general. And then also what's on your mind right now in terms of what is neglected? What should more people be digging into that they're for whatever reason?
Yeah, so I think that generally almost any source of inspiration is fine if it works for people. So the very careful, hyper-rigorous thinking can add some of these constraints in the creative process too early. Just taking some vague inspiration from biology seems like a good idea for idea generation. I'll look at people's creative processes when they make music. It's like Jack Antonoff, for instance, uploads some examples of him making music, and I get a lot out of that, seeing his sort of process there. And for other sorts of musicians and movie directors as well, I think that helps me a lot in giving me some sort of ideas in how to lay track in front of a moving train effectively in a research project. And I think that the idea itself, though, beyond the source of inspiration, seems very good intuition. I think the models have high cognitive empathy. They can guess people's emotions reasonably. But whether that resonates with their internals is a different question. And that would be a matter of more compassionate empathy. Do they actually feel motivated or disposed in a certain way in view of the model of others? So I think something in that direction seems worth investigating further. Yeah, so I think I look forward to that in particular. I don't give faint praise generally.
You and Eliezer both. Eliezer said about that, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it was something like, not obviously stupid on my first read. I rarely give reviews this positive. Any other neglected approaches, especially any you're not going to turn to next?
Yeah, because I guess I'm doing some benchmarking stuff, and I think probably maybe some AI well-being related things. I'm just thinking in drafting the XAI risk management policy, and then what are we going to do about AI well-being? And I just have lots of question marks currently. It's just, I don't know. What are we even going to measure? What are we even going to do? If there can be some clarity, given this theory of consciousness, here's your sort of measure or something like that. Given this theory of consciousness, you just go through these theories of consciousness or something. That could be helpful. I think there are a few demos and examples where they're dishonest, but not good measurements. Truthful QA was the default one, but it was too compute correlated, as we showed in the safety washing paper. So it seems largely just be measuring compute for the most part. Other research things, I'm waiting to see what will happen with the 10x larger models that are arising later this year, early next year. In the meantime, there's measuring a variety of things like agent skills in humanities last exam and virology skills and better circuit breakers and more tamper resistance and more reliability. But then I think maybe we'll have agents from that. And then that will create a whole new variety of issues. I think some other thing I'm working on, which I think is a little interesting, is what should the ethics of these agents be? What should the actual proposals be? But that's not as much of a research question. Maybe that's people who know some legal people should get in discussions with them and try and figure out some ideas there. I think the largest gaps in the intellectually outside of machine learning safety research and more AI safety more broadly construed of stuff that isn't machine learning research would be suggesting strategies about what we should do, what things to push for, what are some coherent worldviews and identifying those and writing those up. So I think, for instance, Leo's thing was very good for identifying a specific worldview of the very short timelines and intelligence explosion one and algorithmic progress matters a lot. Some of those points that you could definitely argue about, and I don't believe as much as he does. But I think there are other views to write up, like what is the national competitiveness platform that is low regret? I think that hasn't been particularly explored. I think people trying to zoom out and look at more than just technical research and see how some of these technical questions and their skill sets can bear on and interact with more complex geopolitical or social or ethical or legal questions is probably where things are most neglected. And there's probably a lot more low-hanging fruit there as well. It's not easy, but I think research is probably harder. I think you're more likely to fail at research just because there haven't been that many good papers across the years. There's thousands of people researching these sorts of things. There's, I don't know, a few people thinking about security mechanisms for GPUs that enable a verification regime for international governance, for instance. I think these intersection issues are maybe the more productive thing for people to focus on.
You mentioned that you're working on the risk management framework for XAI. I guess I take that to be GAI's answer to responsible scaling policy. Is that the right way to think about it?
Yeah, just trying to be somewhat broader, and there's a variety of sources of risk, and I just want more ideas from safety engineering brought to bear. What are other sorts of risks beyond risks from scaling to deal with? Yeah.
So one thing that has definitely stood out to me about the XAI program is the, you might call it, truth maxing goal that Elon has put out in, I think, mostly just tweet form so far. Coming from the old school Eliezer days, the paperclip maximizer thought experiment, I have always tended to think that anything maxing, if the system is powerful enough, is probably a bad idea. And I like the constitutional AI vibe where we have a couple different competing values of, in their case, helpful, honest, harmless, and sometimes they're in tension and the system has to figure out how to balance those and trade them off against each other. And it's not perfect, it's messy, but then so are human values. We seem to get by on that basis. What do you make of the truth maxing? I mean, we could chalk that up to Elon will be Elon on Twitter, but it seems like there's something pretty fundamental there. Do you think that there is a way to have a truth maxing AI that would be still maybe not provably safe, but like qualitatively as safe as a constitutional trained AI system?
I should note I'm not speaking on behalf of XAI here or for Elon. I can largely speak about my interpretations, things he said, and how I try and square all these different organizational goals together in a more coherent risk management policy. So I think he sees a societal risk and is focusing on a societal risk. So normally when people are talking about AI risk and risks that will make AI not go well, people are largely talking about risks emanating from individual AIs. I don't think he intuits instrumental convergence as much of a problem. In fact, I think it is a bit more questionable. And in the AI safety textbook, we discuss arguments for and against instrumental convergence and how strong one might expect that, whether one should by default expect whatever goal you give the AI systems, they become very power seeking. We'll definitely get more of a sense of how strong those tendencies are when we have AI agents soon. So he's thinking that there are, in our risk management policy, the draft of it, it's totally unofficial and maybe it'll change tomorrow. But I'm currently just imitating the Department of Defense's risk management framework from 2001, where they split things up into personnel risks, operational risks, and institutional risks. And we just modify this to machine learning system risks and operational risks. And instead of institutional, it's societal risks. And inside of societal risks, there's a variety of different risks, like bad competitors racing on safety and trying to undermine regulation. That is a risk. And so fortunately, Elon's done things like to be the only major AI player to actually fully support SB 1047. But there is another type of risk, which would be generally public epistemics are not that good, and they need to be in really good shape when we are dealing with this transition to more powerful AI systems and the emergence of AI life forms, so to speak. Things will move very quickly. A lot of important decisions will be made. Biggest period in at least the past 200,000 years, possibly. And so public understanding, if they're to be included in these decision-making processes, needs to be very good. And so that can look like a variety of things, like trying to make sure that Grok is more truthful, add features to the X platform to summarize news in an objective way. And so these are various things that can improve public epistemics and mitigate a societal risk that would definitely bear on whether AI goes well or not. So I think that compared to other organizations that are saying, we're going to be the best on safety, whatever that means, they basically safety wash the research. And there's a particular focus on a specific societal risk. And after having got a basic competent LLM now, there can be more of a focus on adding some of these more epistemic features that improve public epistemics. This trades off on some other notions of harmfulness. This allows, by making models less censored, one could think that could increase harms in some other sorts of ways. But like what Anthropic has, I think generally competitors or competing companies of XAI will censor something if it might be offensive to someone, and that's the threshold. At XAI, it's currently more, if it's legal, it's okay. If it's not illegal, it's not okay. So no copyright, no defamation. But in the future, maybe we'll change the standard to, and I'm not speaking on behalf of them, but at least personally, I think an attractive option is to make the AI chatbots and AI agents exercise reasonable care so that they do not foreseeably cause harms to other people. And by harms, I'm meaning the stuff you would wind up in court over, not something that is minorly offensive or perturbs someone. And that might be the type of ethics and restrictions placed on it, but still sorting that out. And that can allow for a lot of truthful information to disseminate, but not necessarily specific bioweapon instructions, for instance, if those would actually foreseeably cause harm. So I think it's less the training objective equals truth, but instead is XAI is focusing on some other risk sources and trying to specifically target them with AI technology while being responsible in AI development along the way.
So if I try to bottom line that, I would say you're saying big picture fullness of AI potential power, probably not a good idea to go all in on truth maxing, but as a kind of current day competitive positioning and maybe way to counterbalance the arguably mistaken choices of others, being less censorious, more truthful, and leaving the harm reduction piece to the future when harms are greater, focusing more on shared epistemic success now is the overall strategy.
Mm-hmm. And it's not just an AI level intervention. It's also using AIs to help provide technologies that help the public their own understanding and things like that. So it's more constructive. It's not just, I think a lot of safety people think of it in restrictive ways that we got to just control the AI to do this and that. It's also, I think there's some benefits from trying to improve some diffuse societal factors and making this overall project go well. As far as giving AI specifically a truth objective, I think it would depend. My guess is there's a lot of details to fill in there. Maybe some version of that is safe, but I just don't even know what is truth. What theory of truth? Is it a pragmatic theory of truth? Is it something else? I mean, these would have different consequences. As a single objective, Elon said different sorts of things as well. He said maybe it's actually net civilizational happiness. He said that on some different occasions, or there's human autonomy. So there seems to be a mixture of different things he would want in these sorts of systems to promote. And they can be promoted by either giving them that specific objective or using them in some sort of way to help with things like public epistemics and understanding. Some are more close-ended than open-ended, and currently it's done in a more close-ended way.
So we're recording, I think, on the day after you just put out another result on AI-powered forecasting. I haven't even had a chance to read that and absorb it yet. I know there's quite a bit of chatter online. But we did just do an episode with Dare, the new CEO of Metaculus, and so we did run down kind of prior research on powered forecasting. So what's the new result that you have contributed?
I think it's actually not really much of a new result because we didn't even really put up much of a paper. I just wanted to show relevant people a demo of, look, there are forecasting bots that are very good. You could say they're, maybe a 10,000x, 100x, or 100,000x faster and cheaper than prediction markets. And then they can be in the same ballpark of accuracy, which should make them just a preferable option compared to asking a human and paying them a lot of money to forecast something. You can just get an instant answer that like a relatively similar quality, or maybe, or in many cases, better quality than a random experienced forecaster. Of course, there are corner cases. If you ask it something that isn't even a question, it'll still answer. The AIs always have some of those quirks and weird failure modes. But so it's largely to communicate. There's a sort of paper from Jacob's group, Jacob, my advisor in grad school, which was showed, it said in their abstract, we have an AI system that's approaching crowd level performance and in some cases exceeds it. I thought, wow, this is very big. People should start using this. This has dramatic implications. But it didn't seem to catch on. I think most people in forecasting weren't aware of it. And so that this is a sort of communications issue. I think these are not subhuman AI systems. They're actually very competitive for many types of questions. So then we just made a demo to try and communicate this more broadly. And then hopefully it will be integrated, forecasting capabilities, create some interest in it, given that this is something that is within the realm of what AI systems can do, which wasn't the case some years ago when I think we may have done the first AI forecasting sort of paper at NeurIPS in 2022 or something. These models were terrible. Now they're really good with some various exceptions. So yeah, it's largely just trying to get interested in that. And maybe Anthropic could add such a feature. Maybe OpenAI could add such a feature. So yeah, largely just trying to increase attention to that, to increase the probability that it gets adopted as a sort of technology for improving public epistemics. Because I think a variety of places add those sorts of features, and that can be very helpful. But one of the motivations for it is that there's just a lot of things that generally are uncertain and people then aren't even aware of or don't even contemplate. So having some high quality forecast easily accessible helps people appreciate some sort of weirder events down the road. If you ask it, what's the probability that OpenAI gets its weight stolen by China this decade? And someone says like 20%. Okay, you're going to have to learn about InfoSec and things like that to some extent to actually get some sort of probability. It knows that. And I think that can be useful for just improving decision-making and have us not walk into things that could have been easily avoided if there was a bit more expertise in the room. I suppose there's a classic example during COVID. What will COVID be next month? How many cases? And then the president's advisors fit a cubic model to the curve and then forecast, it's going away next month. And the model will show that it's negative the month after or something, the number of cases. I think this sort of institutional decision-making could be greatly helped if people have easily accessible, high competence, fast, and broadly skilled forecasting tools. I think it's mainly some people really like forecasting as a hobby. And so this is getting on people's territory in that way. I think its performance is a bit better than that sort of research paper that was published earlier this year, which I think was basically roughly crowd level in various circumstances, sometimes better, sometimes worse. This model is a little bit better than that. But then people would go, is it better? I know a forecaster who could probably beat this or something. And so it's at least spurred discussions and make people aware of it. But yeah, hopefully it'll end up being integrated, which is the main purpose of it. And that's why, so it's very unusual for me not to have a big paper with a lot of experimental analysis, since I didn't include a lot of experimental analysis and a full write-up. I mean, we seriously wrote up the technical report in, I think, maybe an hour or something like that, just for some basic background information. And then people are like, what's going on? It's so underspecified. Where are the details? Are you hiding something? No, it's just the demo. It's just trying to force this on your attention. That's it. This isn't doing anything too methodologically fresh or anything like that. There's an extensive write-up from Halawi et al. Some months back for a fairly similar system.
You mentioned this potential low-hanging fruit in what a no regrets national competitiveness agenda might look like. I personally currently worry that we might end up having a lot of regrets about our national competitiveness agenda. And I'm interested in your take on it. Specifically, the thing that's in my craw right now, so to speak, is that I feel like decoupling between US and China or West and China when it comes to the general trajectory of AI research and development seems like a recipe for an arms race. And I feel like if we're on the same trajectory, that's at least one meaningful vector in which we could reduce that. We're both developing the same kind of technology. We both know what one another is dealing with. That could be good. In contrast, like we cut off the chips, they have to go some other way. Maybe they might have to start thinking, and I'm reminded often of Samuel Hammond's 95 theses on AI. The one that is burned into my brain is RL-based threat models have been discounted prematurely. And I think, geez, if I'm whatever party functionary in China and I'm like charged with staying competitive with the West on 20% of the compute budget or whatever, maybe I take an asymmetric approach. And maybe that approach is like just far more reckless than the path that we seem to be on, which at least for me has been like surprisingly surprised on the upside in terms of its like friendliness to humans. I can have a remarkably ethically sophisticated conversation with Claude. And I think there's a lot of other things that might come out of a Chinese effort to just keep up with the West at any cost on a significantly reduced compute budget. So that's my worry. You can address my worry. You can raise your own worries. You can plant some seeds for what a no regrets national competitiveness agenda might look like.
Yeah, I don't know if I figure out a complete no regrets one. I think there are some that are much higher regrets, such as like military steps in now and locks up all the sorts of AI projects and securitizes them and moves them to the desert or something. And then we very clearly signal we are in a huge race with you, China, and we will try and poach your people and this sort of stuff. I do think cooperation between the US and China is not very tractable unless there is some sort of catastrophe or if there's very strong signs that there are AIs that are just trying to destroy us and that it's a bigger threat than they are to each other. But absent that, and that will basically not be through convincing them of scenarios. Scenarios don't seem to particularly move our institutions, so it will need to be something actual. I think saying like international coordination is good, reducing competitive pressures is good, reducing arms races is good, but I think maybe coordination looks more like a Western alliance as opposed to an inclusion of China in that. So there are different ways you can do coordination. There's the US goes alone, or the US does things with Europe, and NATO allies are Five Eyes, Canada and Australia and the UK and New Zealand and the US. Or there is including China. But the third one is, I think, just much less tractable. It won't be tractable for some while. So I think on the margin, it makes more sense to try and focus on other things or channel the energies of people's concerns about China's to more productive, lower regret type of options. One of which I haven't spoken with many people about, but I think occurred to me last week is just spending more on, if the government is to spend money on AI stuff, they're just saying we need to support AI R&D. So what does that mean? Does that mean giving money to the labs like OpenAI or the big AI companies? Instead, possibly that money could be spent on just subsidies for chip manufacturing here. There are lots of chip plants being built, and they're being built in different places, some of which are being built here, but they usually need subsidies to be built here. So if they're built here, that seems better from a robustness perspective, because if China invades Taiwan, then TSMC becomes dysfunctional, likely. Either it's destroyed or the supply chain parts that go into it are not given to them. The West is not giving it to them. That would, by default, cause a global depression, possibly a great power conflict. And if compute is so relevant for AI capabilities, it seems important that the US not fall really far behind. The possible strength of the US in a fast takeoff scenario seems to be compute. That would provide a lot of advantage. Or in short timelines, I should say, it provides a lot of advantage. And in long timelines, it provides a lot of advantage, because in long timelines, it's mainly like your economy versus their economy, and the economy will be in large part how many AI systems can you run and how quickly can they run. I think in both scenarios, one's very bullish on AI or bearish on AI, but still thinks it's very salient from a national competitiveness standpoint, possibly focusing on chips and having more robustness to a relatively likely geopolitical catastrophe would be useful. I think forecasting tournaments give it around 30%, and I think the forecasting bot gives it around 30% for this decade. And maybe it'll be higher than that if China sees the US pulling ahead in AI, and this will give them a very dominating position and will really amplify their power relative to China's. Maybe rational for China, not saying it'd be good, but rational for China to invade Taiwan, do something they already wanted to do. There's even more reason to do it. But then that makes things a lot harder for the US and makes it more desperate, and that could get even more ugly. I think there are other sorts of interventions that I think are lower regret, like chip registries. I think adding some basic features onto chips that help verify whether they're in a country that's supposed to have them versus not could be useful. That just may be a bit more contentious. Like if it's in Iran or North Korea, then maybe it shouldn't be functional. So geofencing of some sort. But yeah, I do agree that none of these are costless, but I am acting subject to the constraint that coordination with China isn't really possible unless there's something that looks like a catastrophe or a very convincing near miss scenario. And I think focusing on compute and robustness to some of these geopolitical events that are relatively likely seems like a possible way we could improve national resilience.
Where does that put you on the chip ban today? I think there seems to be a general consensus or near consensus on building more chips at home would be good. Much different thing in my mind from cutting China off from buying from the international market, which we've currently done. If you believe the AGI in 2027, ASI soon after, Western values must prevail argument, then you support the chip ban. If you think that's a lot of conjunctions in that argument and maybe it's going to take longer, then maybe you don't support the chip ban. Is that how you think about it? And do you have an official position on the chip ban?
I think I generally am in favor of export controls. There could be this unintended consequence, though, that it incentivized them very early on to build up chip independence. And if there's an invasion of Taiwan, then mainly the West falls behind and China can continue going ahead. That's a way it could have backfired as an intervention. I think it's a little unclear, but I think overall, though, I think that was a reasonable move that pays off well in short timelines, in long timelines. That suggests algorithmic progress is even less, and so that suggests compute is the more essential thing. I don't think it's not as though if we didn't do export controls, it would be total coordination between the US and China on these issues. I don't think the case. Like the US didn't want China going to the UK AI Safety Summit, just even attending. Okay. And that's just a general thing. This isn't, well, we don't like China on AI safety. That's not it. It's just, they just don't like China. And this is very strong. And it's basically like a negotiation ending to share things with them. And they currently have enough of a competitive advantage in compute and in talent that they are not particularly looking to bargain with them currently. There could be some other sorts of treaties, like a verification regime for GPUs. There could be some angles for coordination, but I think I seek to offset some of those damages from the export controls through other means by maybe working on them with their scientists somewhat more or something like that to build at least goodwill between the scientific communities even more. But yeah, I think overall, I think in many scenarios, the export controls were a reasonable intervention.
Last question. You are the executive director of CAIS, the Center for AI Safety. You guys have a bunch of open roles on your website. I think people probably have a good sense of all the various things that you're involved with, and I assume many of those directions will remain live as you go forward. Pitch the opportunity to work at CAIS and to give us a sense of what you are looking for in teammates.
There's a variety of different topics, and we'll basically keep focusing on new things constantly. So if there's people are wanting a variety of things to do in their work and identify opportunities for impact, to not feel committed to something once its impact has been made, then this is a good dynamic environment. I think that generally intelligence and conscientiousness and experience is the main sort of thing that we care about. It's not really too much to that. It's not looking for whether you believe particular things or something that really doesn't mind, as long as you can work productively and get things done competently. And then, of course, we'll work on research and field building and sort of advocacy and advising for a variety of things. We'll try and be competitiveness on each of those fronts in research and governance types of things. We'll try and make sure that there aren't organizations that are lapping us in any of those sorts of things. Anything AI safety related, tend to work on at some point. Evals, engaging academics, policy, demos, software implementation,
Extinction risk statements.
Yeah.
Things we didn't even bring up. Just in brief, maybe, how did you pull that off? I think everybody knows, right? The extinction risk statement, 2 sentences, signed by all the Dems, Altman and Demis's Hassavas. And similar, people. Like, it was really a remarkable group that came together to sign that. Any tips for pulling off such an achievement?
I think the statement can be found at aistatement.com, for example. I think some of the main mechanisms were actually just modeling. Remember the good regulator theorem, which is if you want to regulate a system, then you need to have a model of that system, like a very good one. And I think that the main barrier for getting people to sign on to that was asking in a particular order. So I just generally have an interest in learning about people and where they're at and keeping track of that. It just seems useful and is interesting in its own right. I just had, to some extent, a sense of who are the people who will sign on early without needing any of their friends. Who are people who are going to need 2 or 3 of their friends to sign on? Who are people who are going to need 7 of their friends to sign on? And so we basically proceeded in that order over the course of a month or so. If we just did something like blasted the email to everybody simultaneously, I think would have completely failed. So that's, I think, the payoff of just having a model of these interacting with these various stakeholders across time and getting a sense of where they're at on AI safety related things. So they're solving a collective action problem. In this case, required, I think, more of a social model.
Who was last to sign? Just kidding. I know you never tell.
I think people came in, but of some of the top signatories. Some people took a bit longer than I expected, but I won't say who.
This has been fantastic. I really appreciate all the time and the breadth of everything that we've discussed. Any closing thoughts or anything you want to plug before we go?
Yeah, I guess you can follow me on Twitter. There's also a course I was mentioning, complex systems and safety engineering, these sorts of and governance issues. These are discussed at aisafetybook.com. And we'll run future versions of the course as well. Another thing is we have a newsletter, which would be newsletter.safe.ai, that we put out every 2 weeks or so. We're trying to just help people be aware of what are the main developments in AI safety. So those are some possible ways to stay connected and to learn more about these topics.
Cool.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. Yeah.
Dan Hendrycks, Executive Director of the Center for AI Safety. Thank you for being part of the Cognitive Revolution. It is both energizing and enlightening to hear why people listen and learn what they value about the show. So please, don't hesitate to reach out via email at tcr@turpentine.co, or you can DM me on the social media platform of your choice.